Some children lose their families in a single terrible moment. Others lose them slowly, one adult decision at a time. I used to think divorce only ended a marriage. Then I watched two parents fight so hard over who deserved their daughters that neither of them stopped to ask what those girls were actually losing. I was only their aunt. I had never given birth to either of them, never imagined I would become anyone's second home. Then one afternoon, my sister looked at her 8-year-old autistic daughter and said softly, "You're getting a new home." Mira thought she meant a different house. So did I. What Adrienne meant was that she had already begun arranging a residential placement because caring for her own child no longer fit the life she wanted. That was the moment I understood something I wish I had learned much earlier. Sometimes family is not decided by blood, custody papers, or who wins in court. Sometimes it is decided by who stays when everyone else begins finding reasons to leave. If you're listening, I hope you'll stay with me to the end, because the worst things in this family didn't happen all at once. And if stories like this mean something to you, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with us for the next one. 3 years before Adrienne told Mira she was getting a new home, I would have defended my sister without hesitation. Not because I thought she was perfect. Nobody who had watched her reorganize a Thanksgiving seating chart because two cousins were bad conversational chemistry could mistake her for easygoing. But Adrienne had always been the person in our family who seemed prepared for whatever came next. She carried spare phone chargers, knew the fastest route to 3 different emergency rooms, kept her tax documents in labeled folders before the rest of us had even started looking for our W-2s, and had built a career that seemed to reward exactly the qualities that exhausted us at family dinners. She was 35 then, already moving into senior management at a healthcare company in Sacramento, and she wore responsibility the way some people wore expensive watches. You could see it from across the room. Her husband, Julian, was harder to measure. That was partly because almost everything Julian did happened before anyone thought to notice it. The first time I began to understand that was on a Tuesday morning in 2013, when I stopped by their house before work. I had left a presentation folder there the weekend before, and expected to be in and out in 5 minutes. Instead, I walked into the kind of controlled chaos that families with small children somehow learn to move through without acknowledging. Phoebe, who was 2, had dropped half a bowl of cereal onto the kitchen floor, and was pressing one socked foot into it, as if she had discovered a new texture worth investigating. 5-year-old Mira sat at the end of the table with both hands around a blue cup, staring at the strip of sunlight that had moved across her placemat. The toaster clicked. The washing machine thumped somewhere down the hall. A cartoon theme song leaked from the living room at low volume. Julian moved through all of it without looking rushed. He switched off the toaster before it could pop because the sudden sound bothered Mira that week. He slid Phoebe away from the cereal without turning it into a battle, wiped her foot, replaced the sock, and put another piece of toast on Mira's plate without asking, because he knew she would eat the first one only after it cooled. Then he checked the small visual strip beside Mira's cup and moved one card from breakfast to shoes. He never announced any of this. He did not look around to see whether someone had noticed. It was simply the shape of his morning. I stood near the junk drawer, hunting for batteries for the remote in their guest room, and asked where Adrienne kept them. Julian pointed with the hand holding Phoebe's abandoned spoon, and told me second drawer down, behind the tape nobody ever put back. Before I could check, Phoebe demanded to know where her purple stuffed rabbit was. Julian said it was under the couch, left side, because she had thrown it there after bath time. Then Adrienne called from upstairs, asking where she had left her car keys. Julian told her they were beside the coffee maker under the mail she had brought in the night before. All 3 answers were right. At the time, I laughed and told him he ought to charge the household a consulting fee. What I did not say was that I still thought of his life as somehow less complicated than my sister's. Adrienne left the house in tailored dresses with a laptop bag over one shoulder and calendar alerts already vibrating on her phone. Julian stayed behind with cereal on his sleeve and a toddler trying to pull open the dishwasher. One of them looked like ambition. The other looked like Tuesday. I was not cruel about it. That almost made my blindness worse. I respected Julian. I liked him. But if someone had asked me what Adrian did, I could have listed her title, company, department, and the promotion she was chasing. If they had asked what Julian did, I probably would have said he stayed home with the girls. 4 words. As though the rest of his day happened automatically after that. Julian had not always planned to stay home. Before Mira was born, he had worked in facilities and operations for a regional property company. After her first year, the appointments started multiplying. Some were evaluations. Some were early intervention services. Some were the ordinary pediatric appointments every new parent faced, except rescheduling anything could knock 3 other pieces of the week loose. By the time Phoebe arrived, the family had reached a practical decision that made sense on paper, and even more sense in daily life. Adrian's income was rising faster. Julian's schedule was less flexible. Childcare for 2 children, combined with Mira's appointments and the transportation between them, would have eaten most of what he brought home anyway. He stepped out of paid work, supposedly for a few years. Adrian used to tell people they were lucky he could do it. I remember that, because I heard her say it more than once. She would watch Julian settle Mira onto his lap at a restaurant before the room got too loud, or catch Phoebe before she launched herself from a chair, and say she did not know how families with 2 working parents managed. Back then, admiration still lived in her voice. Somewhere along the way, the same arrangement that had made their family possible began to embarrass her. It did not happen with a dramatic announcement. Adrian did not wake up one morning and declare that stay-at-home fathers were beneath her. The change came in pieces small enough to dismiss. She started getting invited to dinners with executives 2 levels above her. She joined a hospital partnership committee. Her wardrobe sharpened. Her work trips increased. The people around her talked about acquisitions, promotions, graduate degrees, property investments, and which private elementary schools had 2-year waiting lists. Spouses came up naturally in conversation, and increasingly, I noticed Adrian answering questions about Julian without actually answering them. At my 31st birthday dinner, one of her colleagues asked what Julian did. Adrian picked up her wine glass and said he was between things right now, before turning the conversation toward a new project at work. Julian was sitting 3 seats away. His face did not change, but his thumb stopped rubbing the edge of his napkin. I noticed. Then I let it go. That became one of the things I would remember later, not because the moment was enormous, but because it was so easy to excuse. Maybe she was tired of explaining. Maybe people had been judgmental. Maybe she did not want her husband turned into a conversation about gender roles over dessert. There were always reasonable explanations available if you wanted them badly enough. The first time I saw the difference between what Adrian valued and what Julian actually did for their family was at a company picnic later that summer. Adrian's department had rented a shaded section of a park near the river. There were catered sandwiches, lawn games, a bounce house, and too many portable speakers pointed in different directions. Mira had been excited when we arrived. She liked watching the paddle boats, and for 20 minutes, she stood at the railing with Julian, naming colors while Phoebe chased bubbles nearby. Then a microphone squealed from the picnic shelter. I saw Mira's shoulders rise before I understood what had happened. Her hands went to her ears. The speaker crackled again, followed by applause from a group near the company banner. Julian was beside her almost immediately. He did not tell her to calm down. He did not ask her to use words when words were already becoming harder. He lowered himself until he was inside her line of sight, held out the lightweight headphones he carried in his backpack, and waited. When she took them, he pointed toward a quieter walking path behind the picnic area. She nodded once. It took less than 30 seconds. Adrian had been talking to a vice president and his wife when she noticed them leaving. I watched her eyes follow Julian and Mira toward the trees. Her smile remained in place for the people around her, but something hardened around her mouth. Later, she complained to me that they could never finish one family event without rearranging everything around Mira. She did not say it viciously. That was what made it easy to listen to. She sounded tired. She said she wished Julian would stop assuming that the entire family had to leave the second Mira became uncomfortable. What stayed with me was that he had not asked anyone else to leave. He had simply taken his daughter somewhere quieter. Adrian remained at the picnic with Phoebe for almost another hour. Julian and Mira eventually returned after the speeches were over. Mira had collected 3 smooth stones from the river path and arranged them in size order on the picnic table. She pushed the smallest one toward me when I sat beside her. Julian ate his sandwich cold. Nobody praised him for saving the afternoon. Nobody should have needed to. But I began noticing how often the family kept functioning because Julian adjusted before anyone else had to. He knew Mira could manage a grocery store better, first thing in the morning than late afternoon. He knew which brand of yogurt she accepted, even when the packaging changed. He understood that a warning 5 minutes before leaving the playground worked better than 3 repeated commands at the exact moment they needed to go. He knew Phoebe got mean when she was hungry and Mira got quiet. He could tell from the way Mira flexed 2 fingers against her palm, whether she needed a break or whether she was simply concentrating. Those things sounded small when listed individually. Together, they were an entire language. Adrian knew some of it too. She was their mother. She loved her daughters. I saw her sit on Mira's bedroom floor, one rainy Sunday building the same wooden train loop 6 times, because Mira kept taking apart one curve that did not line up correctly. I saw her sleep beside Phoebe after a stomach bug and go to work the next morning on 3 hours of rest. There were photographs from those years where nothing in her face looked false. That mattered, because what happened later was not the story of a woman who had never cared about her children. It was the story of someone who slowly began measuring care by the things she could see, purchase, schedule, and present, and resenting the parts of parenthood that refused to behave like a project plan. By early 2014, the tension between Adrian and Julian no longer disappeared when company left. The rooms were the same, but the silences had changed. Adrian answered work emails, while Julian cleaned the kitchen. He stopped asking whether she would be home for dinner and simply put a plate in the refrigerator. On therapy days, her name remained on the insurance paperwork, but Julian was usually the person in the waiting room with spare snacks, familiar therapists, and a notebook of what had changed since the previous visit. When Mira's occupational therapist asked both parents to learn a new transition strategy, Adrian could not move a leadership meeting and told Julian to brief her because he was better at that stuff anyway. 2 weeks later, I heard her complain that she was the only adult in the marriage with professional momentum. I still measured work through categories. I understood job, income, mortgage, insurance, and Julian's labor disappeared the moment I tried to put it in those columns. Then came an evening I could not reduce quite so easily. Adrian was supposed to attend a dinner with a senior executive whose recommendation could influence her next promotion. Julian had known about it for weeks. What nobody planned for was Phoebe developing a low fever. The same afternoon, Mira came home already unsettled from a substitute teacher and an unexpected fire drill at school. By 6, Phoebe was limp and hot against Julian's shoulder, while Mira paced between the hallway and kitchen because the order of the evening had stopped making sense. I arrived with children's fever medicine because Julian had texted, asking whether I could pick some up on my way home. He did not ask me to rescue him. He had already called the pediatric nurse line, checked Phoebe's temperature twice, dimmed the kitchen lights, canceled Mira's evening errand, and moved dinner into the living room because she was refusing the table. I found him sitting on the floor between the couch and coffee table, one hand rubbing Phoebe's back while he slid picture cards toward Mira with the other. Adrian came downstairs in heels, holding one earring in her hand. She paused when she saw us. For a few seconds, no one moved. Phoebe coughed into Julian's shirt. Mira pressed both palms to the sides of her head and stared at the front door. Adrian checked the time. She asked whether Julian could handle it. He said he already was. That was all. She put in the second earring and left. I remember the click of the front door more clearly than anything anyone said. The fever broke before midnight. Mira eventually curled up under a weighted blanket with the same nature documentary playing for the third time. I stayed until both girls were asleep. Julian carried cups back to the kitchen and leaned against the counter while the dishwasher hummed. He looked exhausted, but not surprised. Adrian came home after I had left. I knew only what Julian told me days later. She had gotten the recommendation she wanted. Within 6 months, she was promoted. The better things went at work, the more bitter she seemed about home. Not about the girls directly, not yet. About Julian. She began talking about him as though he had failed to launch, rather than stepped out of his career because their family needed someone to. She complained that every financial goal depended on her. She wanted to travel more. She wanted to move into a higher tier at work. She wanted a partner who understood that ambition required sacrifice. What she did not say was whose sacrifice had already made hers possible. One Sunday afternoon, she came to my apartment without the girls. She set her purse on the chair by the door, kicked off her shoes, and spent nearly an hour telling me how lonely it felt to be married to someone who seemed satisfied staying exactly where he was. She said she had changed, and Julian had not. She described his life as comfortable, predictable, protected from the pressure she faced every day. I listened longer than I should have, before reminding her that his predictability was the reason the girls' lives had any. Adrian's mouth tightened. She said caring for the children did not excuse a grown man from having goals. I could have challenged the premise more forcefully. I could have asked whether raising 2 small children, one of whom needed unusually consistent support, counted as a goal only if someone else was paid to do it. Instead, I sat there turning my coffee mug by the handle and tried to see both sides. That was my habit then. I called it fairness. Looking back, I think sometimes neutrality is just uncertainty dressed in nicer clothes. I loved my sister. I also liked Julian. I did not want to become the relative who took sides inside someone else's marriage. Our mother, Patricia, encouraged that instinct. Whenever Adrian complained within her hearing, Mom reminded us that marriages were complicated and outsiders never knew everything. She was not wrong. The problem was that the advice made silence feel virtuous, no matter what we were watching. By spring, Julian and Adrian barely touched. He still packed her coffee if he was making his own. She still texted when meetings ran late. Their life had not exploded. It had thinned. The final break came so quietly, I almost missed its importance. Adrian asked me to meet her after work one evening. She had already spoken to an attorney. She and Julian were going to separate, and she intended to file for divorce once they worked through the immediate logistics. Her voice stayed steady while she explained that this had been coming for a long time. She talked about incompatibility, career differences, resentment, and wanting the girls protected from a house full of tension. None of that shocked me. Then she started describing what would happen afterward. The girls should remain in the house. Mira needed familiar surroundings. Phoebe's daycare was nearby. Adrian's insurance covered Mira's providers. Julian would need to find work, and whatever apartment he could afford at first probably would not offer the same stability. She spoke in the calm, organized tone she used when laying out a business case. I heard myself thinking that some of it made sense. That frightened me only in hindsight. At the time, I pictured the house, the school route, the insurance card in Adrian's wallet, the bedroom Mira already knew. I pictured Julian looking for a job after years outside the workforce and trying to create another home from scratch. If someone had put 2 columns in front of me then, and labeled one stable and one uncertain, I knew which side would have looked stronger. I did not yet understand that a home could stay in the same place, while the person holding it together was removed from the picture. Adrian gathered her purse and stood. The restaurant around us had begun emptying, leaving rings of condensation on the polished tables. I asked only one question that mattered. I asked whether Julian agreed that the girls should live primarily with her. She slipped her phone into her bag. The answer came without hesitation. "He'll fight me." There was no fear in her voice, no sadness either. Something sharper had entered it. I waited. Adrian pulled the strap of her bag over her shoulder and looked directly at me. "I'm not losing my daughters because Julian chose not to build a career." The word that stayed with me was not daughters. It was losing. The first mistake Julian made after Adrian filed for divorce was the kind that looked reasonable while he was making it. That was the part I kept coming back to later. Nobody signed away 10 years of family history in one dramatic moment. Nobody stood in a courtroom and announced that the person who had packed the lunches, sat through therapy appointments, calmed fevers, learned Mira's rhythms, and carried both girls through the ordinary machinery of childhood no longer mattered. What happened was quieter. Julian agreed to something temporary as he thought temporary still meant temporary. By the time Adrian officially filed in early 2014, the separation had already changed the physical shape of their lives. She stayed in the family house with the girls. Julian moved first into a short-term rental, then into a small 2-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes away. The second bedroom was barely large enough for 2 twin beds and a dresser, and the kitchen looked out over a parking lot instead of a backyard. But he set up the girls' room before he bought himself a proper dining table. Mira's side had the same soft lamp she used at home, the same kind of blackout curtain, and a plastic bin filled with the familiar objects she reached for when a new place felt too new. Phoebe's stuffed rabbit sat on the other bed, one ear permanently bent from being dragged by the arm. Julian had also started interviewing for jobs again. That transition was harder than I had understood when Adrian first talked about it, as if all he needed to do was update a resume. Employers asked what he had been doing for the last several years. He told them the truth. He had left facilities work to stay home with his children. Some interviewers nodded warmly and moved on. Others looked at the gap as if it were a stain that needed explaining. He eventually found an operations position with a regional maintenance company. The salary was decent, but the first 90 days came with the kind of rigid schedule people often have when they are trying to prove they are worth keeping. He could not stroll into a new job and immediately demand every Tuesday afternoon, alternate Friday, therapy morning, school pickup, sick day, and last-minute caregiver cancellation. He had spent years being the parent whose schedule bent around everyone else. Now, suddenly, his availability had a supervisor attached to it. The temporary custody arrangement was negotiated during that exact window. I learned most of the mechanics because Julian explained them to me afterward, and because Adrian talked about the process as if she were preparing a quarterly strategy review. Their attorneys worked through temporary possession of the house, parenting time, expenses, and who would make which decisions while the divorce moved forward. Nothing happened in one afternoon. There were forms, conferences, proposed schedules, revised schedules, and long stretches where neither of them seemed satisfied enough to call anything settled. Julian could have pushed harder for equal school night time immediately. Instead, he agreed that the girls would spend most weekdays in the family house for the first several months, while he got through his probationary period at work and finished setting up the apartment. He told me he thought it would spare Mira 2 major changes at once. Her parents were separating. Julian no longer woke up in the same house. Phoebe was already asking where Daddy slept, moving the girls back and forth on a complicated weekday schedule. While Julian was still learning a new job, felt, to him, like adding instability just to prove a point. He did not use those words in court. He did not think of it as a legal strategy at all. He thought of it as Tuesday night. He thought of whether Mira would sleep. That distinction mattered more than any of us understood. For a while, I thought Adrian and Julian were simply making the least bad decision available. The girls stayed in the house they knew. Their rooms remained unchanged. Mira stayed in the same school program and saw the same providers. Phoebe's daycare route did not change. Julian had defined parenting time and additional visits when schedules allowed. He still appeared at school meetings and appointments whenever he could. On weekends with him, the girls' apartment slowly became less temporary. He bought a second. The part I missed was how fast a temporary pattern could start looking like proof. Adrian did not need to invent anything. The girls really were spending more nights in the family house. She really did carry the employer health insurance. Mira really did have an established school routine centered there. Adrian really did have the larger house and the higher income. The facts were all true. They simply did not explain how those facts had come to exist. The house itself became one of the first things I misunderstood. Adrian had temporary use while the case was pending, but it remained marital property. At judgment, she refinanced and bought out Julian's share. He received his equity and limited transitional support while returning to full-time work, with child support reflecting income and parenting time. He was financially tighter than Adrian, not penniless, and the smaller apartment was not proof that he had contributed less to the marriage. By then, our conversations had become careful, so I watched more than I spoke. Adrian knew I was not automatically agreeing with her anymore. I knew she would hear open criticism as taking Julian's side, so I watched more than I spoke. I watched her turn temporary circumstances into a permanent presentation. Adrian was very good at presentation. By the time the permanent custody discussions became serious in 2015, she had assembled a parenting structure that looked almost impossible to criticize. The girls would remain in the same home. Mira would stay in the same school environment. Adrian's insurance covered her existing providers. She had arranged backup care, transportation options, and after-school help. She could name the company she planned to use when additional support was needed, and explain how she intended to keep both girls' schedules stable. It was not fraudulent. That was what made it powerful. Julian had a different kind of evidence, but he never seemed to understand that evidence had to be made visible before anyone could weigh it. His attorney pushed him to document the history of day-to-day caregiving more clearly. Julian provided calendars, appointment histories, school records, and whatever else was requested, but emotionally he resisted turning fatherhood into a resume. He had done bedtime, he had done mornings. He had learned Mira's transition strategies and managed the years when a change in breakfast packaging could turn the first hour of the day into something none of them could recover from quickly. He had been the parent the preschool called first, because he was the one available. He had learned to carry extra clothes, headphones, snacks, and a backup plan without thinking about it. To Julian, those things were not achievements to list. They were just his daughters. That was admirable in a living room. It was less useful in litigation. There were moments when even I wanted to shake him. Not because he was wrong about what mattered, but because he seemed to believe everyone else would automatically understand its value. He had spent so long doing invisible work that he had adopted the same bad habit the rest of us had. He assumed invisible meant obvious. Adrian never made that mistake. She understood exactly what could be counted. She also understood how to make herself look cooperative. One of the proposals that impressed me most at the time was hers. Adrian suggested including a right of first refusal provision in their parenting plan. The language was more formal than the phrase itself, but the concept was simple. If one parent needed non-routine childcare for a meaningful block of time during that parent's custodial period, the other parent should have the chance to take the girls before a nanny or paid caregiver was used, assuming school and therapy needs still worked. When Adrian explained it to me, she made it sound generous. She said the girls deserved access to both parents whenever possible, and she did not want the divorce turning Julian into a weekend visitor. I remember thinking maybe I had been too suspicious. The provision looked like exactly the kind of thing a bitter parent would refuse, and a reasonable parent would volunteer. Julian agreed to it, so did his lawyer. At the time, nobody treated the clause as important enough to become a family story. It was one paragraph among pages of schedules, holidays, school decisions, healthcare responsibilities, pickup arrangements, and financial terms. Years later, I would remember where I was sitting when Adrian told me she had insisted on it. At the time, I just thought she was proving me wrong. Our mother thought so too. Patricia had perfected a version of neutrality that required very little from her except disapproval of anyone who became visibly angry. She loved both daughters, liked Julian, adored the girls, and wanted the divorce to happen in a way that would allow everyone to sit at the same table by Christmas. Whenever I tried to talk about the imbalance between what Julian had actually done and what Adrian could show on paper, Mom reminded me that judges saw information we did not see, and that children needed stability more than adults needed vindication. Again, she was not entirely wrong. That was becoming the pattern of those years. Almost every damaging choice came wrapped in a sentence that was technically reasonable. The final custody order reflected that. They retained joint legal custody, which meant Adrian did not receive unlimited authority over major decisions. Julian remained entitled to participate in significant choices involving education, healthcare, and the girls' welfare. Adrian received primary physical custody. Julian had substantial defined parenting time, access to providers and school information, holidays, and the first refusal provision that was supposed to keep paid care from replacing an available parent unnecessarily. Nobody called him an unfit father. Nobody said his years at home had meant nothing. But the result still placed the center of the girls' lives in Adrian's house. When the decision came, I was with Julian at his apartment because I had promised to bring over an old bookcase that fit the girls' room. His attorney called while we were trying to maneuver it around a corner in the hallway. Julian listened for several minutes without speaking. He set one hand flat against the top shelf and stared at a screw that had backed halfway out of the wood. I could not hear the attorney clearly. I did not need to. Julian's shoulders changed. That was all. After the call, he tightened the loose screw before he said anything about the order. There was something painfully Julian about that. Even while learning he had lost the argument over where his daughters would live most of the time, he fixed the furniture they would use when they came to him. He told me the schedule. He told me they still had joint legal custody. He told me the weekends, the weekday time, the holidays. He said his attorney believed the decision leaned heavily on the temporary status quo and continuity of school and home, combined with the practical limits of Julian's new job. He never said the judge thought Adrian loved the girls more. Still, I saw what he heard underneath it. He had shaped his life around the children for years. Then, during the exact period when he was trying to rebuild a paycheck because his marriage had ended, the rebuilding itself had become part of the reason he did not remain the primary residential parent. I helped him finish the bookcase. Neither of us talked much. Phoebe arrived the following weekend, carrying a backpack, almost as large as she was. Mira walked in more slowly, stopped beside the new shelf, and ran one finger along the edge Julian had tightened. She noticed the lamp first, then the curtain, then the bin beside her bed. Her shoulders lowered a little. Julian noticed too. He did not turn to me for credit. That evening, we ate takeout pizza at the small table he had finally bought. Phoebe peeled the cheese from her slice and piled it onto Julian's plate. Mira ate only the crust until Julian cut another piece differently. For 10 minutes, the legal order sitting in an envelope on the kitchen counter seemed to belong to somebody else's life. That was one of the last uncomplicated memories I had of the four of us before Adrian's victory started changing shape. At Adrian's house, the mood was different. She did not throw a party. She did not brag that she had won. If anything, she seemed calmer than she had in months. The legal uncertainty was over. Her house remained the girls' primary home. Her work schedule could now be built around a known custody calendar. She began making practical changes almost immediately. But there was something else in her relief that reminded me of what she had told me before the divorce began, even if I did not yet know how dangerous it would become. She had not lost. I saw it in the way she straightened when people asked how custody had been resolved. She would explain that the girls were staying primarily with her because keeping their home, school, insurance, and routine consistent had been judged best. All of that was true. Yet the story became cleaner each time she told it. The temporary arrangement disappeared from the explanation. Julian's years as the primary hands-on caregiver became background. His decision not to move the children more aggressively during his job transition became evidence of Adrian's superior stability rather than a concession he had made for them. She did not have to lie. She only had to shorten the story. I began noticing how often shortening a story changed who looked guilty. To her credit, Adrian did try to make the new system work. She hired help, organized the school calendar, kept shared events in the co-parenting system, and made sure Julian could access provider information. For a few months, I wondered whether the worst part was behind us. Julian seemed determined to make the arrangement functional too. He did not talk to the girls about losing custody, ask them to choose households, or treat Mira's transition struggles as evidence against Adrian. He still made mistakes, while Adrian documented hers and his with very different levels of precision. Julian still believed good faith had survived the litigation. I did not yet understand how quickly Adrian would begin to experience accepting his help as a verdict on the competence she had just spent a year proving. It happened only a few weeks after the permanent schedule settled in. Adrian had hired a woman to handle several after-school blocks during her work week, including one long afternoon when she had a standing leadership meeting downtown. The arrangement looked solid until the caregiver called out unexpectedly. I happened to be at Adrian's house because she had asked me to drop off a package our mother had sent with me. She was standing at the kitchen island with her laptop open, scrolling through messages with the clipped movements she used when an unexpected problem had entered a day she had already planned. Mira was at school. Phoebe was at daycare. Julian, according to the schedule, was not due to have the girls until later in the week. I watched Adrian open the co-parenting app. For 1 second, I thought of the clause she had proudly described months earlier. Apparently, so did Julian. Before Adrian even contacted him, a message from him appeared. He had heard about the childcare gap through the shared schedule and told her he could rearrange the end of his workday if she needed him to take both girls. He would collect Mira after school, pick up Phoebe, and keep them through the evening. It was exactly what the right of first refusal language had been designed to encourage. Adrian read the message twice. Her face remained blank. I asked whether that solved the problem. She closed the app. I already handled it. A few minutes later, another paid caregiver confirmed she could cover the block. Adrian returned to her laptop, as if nothing important had happened. I stood in her kitchen looking at the phone she had placed face down beside the sink. The clause she had used to prove she would never replace an available father with hired help had survived less than a month before becoming inconvenient. For a little while, Adrian's system worked. That was what made what followed so dangerous. If everything had fallen apart the week after she won primary custody, maybe even she would have been forced to admit that the plan had been built around appearances instead of real life. Instead, there were months when it seemed as though she had been right. The girls stayed in the house they knew. Mira remained in the same school program. Phoebe kept the same daycare. Adrian's employer insurance continued covering appointments, and a rotating schedule of paid help filled the hours between school and the end of her workday. Her calendar became a carefully fitted grid of pickups, therapy sessions, meetings, dinners, and blocks, labeled with other people's names. I remember standing in her kitchen one evening while she scrolled through the week on her tablet. Everything had a color. Mira's appointments were one shade, Phoebe's activities another, work travel another, Julian's parenting time another. At first glance, it looked calm. Adrian seemed calmer too. She had always been good when life could be converted into systems. She knew which nights the girls slept in her house, which weekends belonged to Julian, when the nanny arrived, when a backup sitter was on call, and exactly how long she had between leaving the office and needing to be somewhere else. For a few months, I wondered whether I had been unfair. Maybe I had confused resentment with incompetence. Maybe Adrian really could give the girls everything she had promised. Maybe the distance between what Julian used to do and what paid support did now was mostly sentimental. Then the first caregiver quit. She lasted just over 6 weeks. Adrian said the woman had been unreliable, though what I heard later was that the hours kept changing. A meeting ran late, a therapy appointment moved. A Friday evening became a Saturday morning. Then an extra request appeared because Adrian had agreed to attend a networking event. None of those changes was catastrophic by itself. Together, they turned a part-time job into something that required the worker's life to remain almost as flexible as Julian's had once been. Adrian replaced her within days. The second woman lasted longer, but Mira never settled around her. It was not dramatic. There was no single scene where the child screamed until the caregiver fled. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, small things accumulated. Mira began eating less after school. She stopped using the living room in the afternoon because the caregiver liked the television on. She started asking, in the limited way she could then, who would be there before leaving school each day. If the answer changed, she sometimes stood beside the front door after getting home, instead of taking off her backpack. I noticed because I had started spending more time at Adrian's house again. Part of it was guilt. I had watched the custody case from the edge and told myself I was staying neutral. Now that it was over, I wanted to believe I could simply be an aunt again. Mira made that difficult in the best way. She had developed a habit of bringing me objects instead of asking for attention directly. A smooth stone meant she wanted me to sit near her. A particular paperback meant she wanted me to read, even if she did not look at the page. Once she placed a spoon on my knee and walked away. I spent several minutes trying to interpret it before Julian, when I told him later, laughed, and explained that the spoon belonged to a yogurt she liked and she had probably wanted me to get one from the refrigerator. He had understood her from 20 miles away. I had been sitting 3 feet from her. There was humility in loving Mira if you were willing to accept it. She could make you realize how often adults confuse talking with understanding. The second caregiver eventually left after an argument over evening availability. When another long block of care appeared in the co-parenting app, Julian offered to take both girls. Adrian answered that the child care had already been scheduled and therefore did not fall under the first refusal provision. His attorney advised him to document the disagreement rather than turn every block into a legal emergency, so he did. Adrian hired someone else. The dates blurred later. The pattern did not. I could tell the refusals were about more than scheduling, though I had not yet heard Adrian say why. Every time Julian stepped in easily, he reminded her of a skill she had dismissed during the marriage. A new caregiver needed a briefing. Julian already knew the girls. The third caregiver was Maeve Ortiz. I liked her almost immediately. She was in her mid-50s, wore practical shoes, carried a canvas bag that looked as if it had survived several wars, and had the kind of face that made dishonesty feel like extra work. She did not arrive promising miracles. She asked questions. She watched. She wanted to know what Mira liked, what she avoided, how she reacted when plans changed, what words she used reliably, what signals adults often missed, and which routines mattered because they helped, rather than because someone had always done them that way. Adrian seemed relieved to have found someone experienced. Mira was cautious. Maeve did not take the caution personally. That alone put her ahead of several adults I knew. The first afternoon I spent with them, I arrived carrying what I thought was an extremely useful emergency kit. By then I had begun trying to compensate for my earlier blindness by becoming aggressively helpful. I had printed a schedule, labeled small bags for snacks and spare clothes, added backup headphones, wipes, tissues, batteries. Maeve looked at the pile spread across Adrian's dining table. She asked whether we were helping Mira or opening an airport. I told her I liked being prepared. She glanced at the color-coded tabs. So does the Pentagon. Mira was sitting at the table with us. She looked at the labels, then at me. and pushed two unused ones across the surface toward my side. I removed them. It was the first time I understood that helping someone did not require turning their life into a project. Maeve learned faster than the others had, because she was willing to observe before correcting. If Mira stood in the hallway after school, Maeve did not immediately redirect her. She waited to see whether Mira was transitioning or stuck. If Mira refused a snack, Maeve checked whether the packaging had changed before assuming she was being difficult. If a routine needed to change, she warned her instead of pretending the change should not matter. The difference showed in small ways. Mira started taking off her backpack again. Her appetite stabilized. She returned to the living room in the afternoons. Once, when Maeve arrived, Mira moved a pile of blocks from the couch so there would be room for her to sit. Maeve treated the space Mira cleared for her on the couch as exactly what it was: trust. Not a miracle or a breakthrough. Adrian appreciated the results and said Maeve was worth the money because she did not need constant supervision. What bothered me was that Maeve's strength came from the same kind of patient observation Julian had practiced for years, a connection Adrian still refused to make. Adrian still refused to make that connection. At the same time, the difference between Mira's place in Adrian's life and Phoebe's began widening in ways that did not initially look cruel. Phoebe was 4, almost 5, and easy to take places in the conventional sense. She could sit through brunch with crayons. She could walk through a department store without becoming overwhelmed by the lights. She liked new dresses, fancy cupcakes, hotel elevators, and the attention she got when Adrian introduced her to people. Mira did not enjoy most of those environments. Noise tired her. Crowds could make her withdraw. Changes in food, seating, smells, or plans took work. None of that made her incapable of going anywhere, but it meant the adults around her had to think ahead. Adrian increasingly chose not to. One Saturday, she took Phoebe to a charity luncheon, connected to work, and left Mira at home with Maeve. The explanation was practical. The event would be long and loud, and Mira would be happier at home. That was probably true. The second time, Adrian took Phoebe shopping afterward. The third time, a weekend outing became lunch, shopping, and dinner with Grant. Mira stayed behind again. There was no single decision I could point to and call abandonment. That was how these things grew. One reasonable exception became a pattern, and the pattern became a life. I would arrive at Adrian's house and find a new photograph on the entry table of Adrian and Phoebe at some event while Mira sat in the den, arranging colored pencils into groups. Phoebe would come home with stories about restaurants, elevators, hotel lobbies, and people whose names Mira had never heard. Mira rarely complained. That made it easier for everyone else not to. I started taking her out more often myself. Nothing elaborate. A quiet bookstore first thing in the morning, a park she liked, a small bakery before the lunch crowd arrived. I learned that she enjoyed being out, when being out did not require enduring someone else's idea of fun. Julian already knew that. When he had the girls, he rarely separated them by convenience. He planned around both. A noisy place got a shorter visit. A long outing got a quiet break. Phoebe learned to wait 5 minutes. Mira learned that not every change meant disaster. They annoyed each other, argued over toys, stole snacks, and occasionally refused to be in the same room. They were sisters. At Adrian's house, increasingly, they were becoming 2 separate categories of difficulty. I saw the legal side of that separation during a therapy schedule change. Julian offered to pick up Mira, take her to the familiar clinic, and keep Phoebe too while Adrian worked. Adrian declined because a caregiver was already scheduled and said another handoff would disrupt Mira. Maeve took her instead. Maeve later confirmed only what she had witnessed. Julian had offered, Adrian had said the arrangements were settled, and Maeve had done the job she was hired to do. Sitting in my car afterward, I kept thinking about the word stability. Julian taking his own daughter to a familiar appointment could be called disruption, while a paid caregiver doing the same thing counted as continuity. Around that time, Grant began appearing more regularly. He was not yet deeply woven into the family, but he was no longer just someone Adrian mentioned. He had a calm way about him, dressed well without looking like he tried too hard, and listened when people spoke. I did not dislike him. That complicated things later. Grant only knew the version of the divorce Adrian had given him. Julian had struggled after the separation. Adrian had primary custody. The girls had remained in their original home, and she had built a care structure while he rebuilt his career. All of that was true. The missing pieces lived between those facts. One evening, I heard Adrian tell Grant that Julian was not very involved anymore. She said it casually, while opening a bottle of wine in the kitchen. Mira was in the next room with Maeve. Phoebe was coloring at the counter. Grant nodded as though the statement matched what he already believed. I was standing close enough to see Julian's message from earlier that week still visible on Adrian's tablet because she had left the co-parenting app open. He had asked to take both girls on Friday. Adrian had responded that Phoebe had plans and Mira's routine was already set. That was the moment the problem changed for me. Before then, I had watched Adrian deny help. Now I watched the denial turn into absence. She had said no to Julian, then told Grant he was not very involved. Phoebe was too young to see the distinction, and Mira could not easily walk into a room and challenge an adult version of events. A few months earlier, I might have accepted Adrian's sentence myself. Now, I could feel the edges of the lie. I still hesitated to confront her, because there was always another explanation available. Then, Maeve needed several days off. Julian again offered to adjust his work schedule and take the girls, and Adrian found another temporary caregiver. By then, I had run out of ways to make the pattern look accidental. I went to her house after work and found her standing at the kitchen counter sorting mail. Phoebe's glittery hair clip sat beside a stack of envelopes. Mira's headphones rested on a chair near the doorway. The house looked polished, warm, organized. That was part of what made the conversation so ugly. Nothing around us looked broken. I asked why she kept paying strangers when Julian was available, and asking for time with his own daughters. Adrian did not explode. She did not call him names. She kept opening the mail. For a few seconds, I thought she would give me another explanation about routine or schedules. Instead, she set one envelope down. Her fingers flattened it against the granite. Because every time I need him, he gets to pretend I couldn't do this without him. She returned to the stack, as though she had only explained a scheduling preference. I stared at the side of her face. For the first time, Julian's availability looked less like comfort to Adrian than humiliation. If his ability to care for the girls felt like evidence against her, every request for help carried a meaning that had nothing to do with what the children needed. Once I understood how threatening Julian's usefulness felt to Adrian, the missed pickups, paid caregivers, and arguments about routine stopped looking like unrelated irritations. The pattern required very little force. Control enough small moments that his absence looked natural, then explain the empty space. The first time I saw that process from beginning to end happened outside Mira's therapy center in early 2016. I had agreed to meet Julian there because he was supposed to pick up both girls afterward and take them for the evening. Phoebe had been with Adrian that afternoon, and Julian planned to collect her on the way back from Mira's appointment. I was dropping off a library book Mira had left in my car after our weekend outing. Julian's truck was already parked near the far end of the lot when I arrived. He sat inside with the engine off, one arm resting against the steering wheel. Through the windshield, I could see a small paper bag on the passenger seat. Later I learned it held the crackers Mira usually ate after therapy and a juice box for Phoebe. He had been there about 15 minutes. Mira's appointment ended. No one came out. A minute later, Julian looked down at his phone. He stayed still long enough for me to notice the change before he opened the door. Adrian had messaged him through the co-parenting app. The therapy schedule had shifted, she said, and she had decided Mira needed to go straight home afterward instead of transitioning into his evening time. Phoebe, according to the message, was already committed to plans with Adrian. Julian showed me the screen because I asked what had happened. His reply was brief. He reminded Adrian that this was his scheduled parenting time and asked whether she intended to provide makeup time. The answer came several minutes later. Adrian said they could discuss another evening once Mira had settled. Julian did not march into the building. He did not call her repeatedly. He did not create a confrontation in the parking lot where Mira might walk out and see both parents angry. He stood beside his truck, folded the top of the paper bag closed, and put it behind the seat. That image stayed with me longer than the messages did. The snacks had been prepared for children who were not coming. Julian told me his attorney had already warned him that not every scheduling dispute justified an emergency motion. He was supposed to preserve the messages, keep exchanges calm, request makeup time in writing, and document patterns if they developed. So he did. That restraint would later be used against him in ways none of us understood yet. I went to Adrian's house that evening because I had promised Phoebe I would return a picture book. I did not intend to discuss the exchange in front of the girls. Phoebe was sitting at the kitchen island eating apple slices when I arrived. She asked whether Daddy had been busy. I froze just inside the doorway. Adrian was rinsing a glass at the sink. She told Phoebe that Dad could not come that night, and they would see him another time. The sentence was not dramatic. That was why it hit me so hard. Phoebe accepted it immediately. At 5 years old, why wouldn't she? Adults told her how the world worked. Dad was not there. Mom said Dad could not come. The two facts fit together cleanly. I looked at Adrian's back while water ran over the glass in her hand. Julian had been waiting in the parking lot. Phoebe would never know that unless someone told her. I almost corrected Adrian right there. Then Mira came in from the hallway rubbing one thumb across the edge of her sleeve, and the moment passed. I did not want to turn a 5-year-old snack into a custody dispute. That instinct to protect the children from conflict was reasonable. Adrian had begun learning how useful reasonable instincts could be. A week later, Patricia witnessed another denied exchange. Mira had already had a difficult morning. Adrian decided another transition would be too much, and Julian arrived without knowing his scheduled time had been canceled. Mom saw him wait outside and ask for makeup time, while Adrian insisted she was protecting Mira's routine. Later, she heard Adrian tell Phoebe only that Daddy could not take them because Mira was having a hard day. When Mom told me about it over coffee, she focused on how rigid both parents were becoming. I reminded her that one parent had driven across town for court-ordered time, and the other had unilaterally refused it. Patricia folded her napkin into smaller rectangles and finally said, "Don't get in the middle." She had always believed peace could be preserved by refusing to make an uncomfortable truth official. For the first time, I saw what that kind of neutrality could protect. Julian responded by becoming precise rather than aggressive. On his attorney's advice, he kept scheduling requests in the co-parenting system, asked for clarification when exchanges changed, requested specific makeup dates, and put first refusal offers in writing. The messages were ordinary dates, times, pickups, replies, which was exactly why they would matter later. Maeve noticed it too. One Friday, Adrian hired her for most of the afternoon and evening because of a work dinner. Julian had messaged earlier, offering to take both girls for the block. Maeve knew that because Adrian mentioned the offer while reviewing the day's schedule and dismissed it as impractical. Maeve did not argue. She was an employee in someone else's home, and she understood that distinction better than I did. But later, when I arrived to drop off Mira's library books, Maeve said she had been surprised Julian was not taking the girls because she had heard Adrian say he was available. That was all she claimed. She did not tell me Adrian was manipulating anyone. She did not pretend she understood the divorce. She simply handed me a fact. Adrian had needed childcare. Julian had offered. Adrian had paid Maeve instead. Mira sat nearby, lining up markers by length while we spoke. She paused once when Julian's name came up, then continued arranging them. That tiny pause made me wonder how much of these adult choices entered her world even when we assumed she was not listening. By then, Adrian's language about Mira had begun changing in another way. She no longer spoke only about schedules being difficult. She began talking about how every decision had to revolve around Mira. I heard it after a weekend plan fell apart because the restaurant Adrian wanted to try was loud, crowded, and running nearly an hour behind its reservation time. Mira had managed the first 20 minutes, then stopped eating and covered her ears as the room filled. Adrian took both girls home early. The next day, she described the evening as another example of why the family could never do anything spontaneous. She did not blame Mira directly. Not exactly. But the word everything started appearing. Everything had to be planned around Mira. Everything took longer. Everything required preparation. Every outing could change. Every caregiver needed training. Every weekend was complicated. The word transformed a child into a climate condition. You did not blame rain for existing. You simply resented how often it ruined your plans. Phoebe increasingly became the child Adrian could take into the life she wanted without negotiation. She went with Adrian and Grant to brunch. She went shopping. She attended another company family event where someone gave her a balloon and took photographs near a backdrop. Grant began appearing in those pictures too. Mira was not banned. That distinction mattered. Adrian simply made choices where leaving Mira home seemed easier, then used the ease of leaving her home as proof that the choice had been correct. Sometimes Mira really did prefer staying with Maeve. Sometimes she preferred coming with me to the same quiet bookstore we had started visiting on Saturday mornings. The problem was not that Mira had to attend every noisy event to prove she belonged. The problem was that fewer and fewer people bothered asking what kind of outing she might enjoy too. Phoebe did. She still brought things back for her sister. A napkin folded around 2 cookies, a cheap plastic bracelet from a party favor bag. Once she returned from a shopping trip with a pair of bright socks covered in tiny yellow ducks because she had decided Mira would think the ducks looked angry. Mira studied them for a long time. Then she wore them 3 days in a row. The girls were not separating themselves. The adults were creating separate lives around them. Julian kept asking for both girls. Sometimes Adrian said Phoebe already had plans. Sometimes Mira's therapy complicated the timing, and sometimes he accepted partial time because refusing to see one daughter would not create time with the other. From Phoebe's side, the result could look as if Dad kept leaving with Mira alone. One particular weekend later became important enough that I remembered it clearly. Julian had asked for both girls from Saturday morning until Sunday afternoon. It was not part of his regular weekend, but he had tickets to a small outdoor train exhibit Mira liked and had planned a simple picnic afterward. Phoebe had been excited about feeding ducks at the park nearby, the last time she went with him. Adrian replied that Phoebe already had plans with her and Grant. She offered Julian a shorter Saturday visit with Mira instead. He took it. I met them at the park for part of the afternoon. Mira spent nearly 40 minutes watching a model train make the same loop without getting bored. Julian sat beside her with a paper cup of coffee gone cold. He never mentioned Phoebe in a way that would burden Mira with the absence, but I saw the second juice bottle in the cooler. He had packed for 2 girls. Again. Later that evening, I stopped by Adrian's house to return something Mira had left in my car. Phoebe was showing Grant a bracelet she had gotten at an outdoor market. She asked whether Mira had fun with Dad. Adrian said yes, then added that Dad had wanted some special time with Mira. The words sounded affectionate. They were also not true. Julian had asked for both. Standing in the hallway with Mira's forgotten sweater, I finally had a name for what I was seeing. Adrian was not only limiting access, she was editing the explanation afterward. No single softened sentence could rewrite a childhood. Years of them could. Correcting those stories in front of Phoebe would have dragged a 5-year-old into an adult dispute, while saying nothing left Adrian's version uncontested. Julian faced the same trap and refused to interrogate the girls after visits, or turn them into witnesses. His restraint protected them from open conflict, but it also left room for someone else to explain every absence. Grant was learning the family through the same method. Most of what he knew about Julian came from Adrian's ordinary descriptions of an inconsistent ex-husband. She never needed a malicious speech. Repeated selective sentences did the work. That spring, Mira's world became less predictable again. Maeve stayed, but Adrian increased her hours. There were more dinners, more late meetings, more events with Grant, who had begun discussing a future with her. Mira spent longer blocks with paid care even on days Julian had indicated he was available. The tension between Adrian and me sharpened. We did not have screaming fights. We had shorter phone calls. She stopped asking what I thought. I stopped pretending I believed every explanation. Then, one afternoon in early summer, Grant said something he was not supposed to say. I had gone to Adrian's house because Mira was spending the night with me later that week, and I was checking that the headphones she liked were in her bag when Grant came in carrying several flattened cardboard boxes from the garage. I assumed Adrian was clearing storage. Grant set the boxes against the wall and mentioned, in the casual tone of someone discussing logistics everyone already understood, that there were probably enough boxes for Mira's things when the move happened. I looked at him. For a second, I thought he meant Adrian and Grant were buying a new house. That would have explained a lot. I asked when they were moving. Grant's expression changed just enough for me to notice. His eyes flicked toward the hallway before he said he meant Mira's move to the residence. The word sat strangely in the room. Not a new house for Adrian and Grant, but somewhere Mira would go without them. I looked down at the cardboard boxes leaning against the wall. My hands had gone still over Mira's bag. Grant seemed to understand, too late, that I had not been told. He began explaining that Adrian had said everything was still being finalized, and that she wanted to wait until the plan was firm before involving the extended family. I barely heard the rest. Mira was in the next room. I could hear the low electronic sound of the program she was watching, and the occasional scrape of something moving across the coffee table. I walked toward the hallway. Adrian came down the stairs before I reached it. She saw Grant, the boxes, then my face. For several seconds, nobody spoke. All the explanations I had accepted over the previous year, stability, routine, professional care, too many transitions seemed to collect in that silence. Adrian looked past me toward the den where her daughter sat. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost reassuring. "You're getting a new home." Adrian's voice was so gentle that, for one terrible second, the words sounded loving. "You're getting a new home." Mira looked up from the den doorway. At 8, she still needed extra time, when language arrived wrapped in something unexpected. Her eyes moved from Adrian to the flattened boxes beside the kitchen wall, then to Grant, then back to me. She did not ask where the house was. She did not smile. She only pinched the seam of her sleeve between 2 fingers and began rubbing the fabric in the slow, repetitive motion I had learned, meant she was processing more than anyone around her seemed willing to wait for. I had thought Grant was talking about Adrian moving. Now the boxes looked different. Everything in the room did. Adrian began explaining that the place was designed for children who needed more structure than ordinary homes could always provide. She had already spoken with the program. There were trained staff, predictable schedules, therapeutic support, and other children with similar needs. The way she described it made the decision sound almost clinical, as though she had compared insurance plans and chosen the one with the better network. I kept looking at Mira. No one had told her what those words meant. A new home, not a different bedroom with Mom and Phoebe, but a place where the people putting her to bed would be employees. I asked Adrian how far along the process was. She did not answer directly. She said there had been phone consultations, an intake conversation, preliminary questions about Mira's routine and school supports, and discussion of whether the program had an appropriate opening. Nothing was final, she insisted. She had wanted to wait until she knew the placement was viable before upsetting everyone. The phrase upsetting everyone landed harder than it should have. The decision itself had apparently not required everyone. Only the reaction did. I moved the headphones in Mira's overnight bag, even though they did not need moving. My fingers needed something harmless to do. If I let myself look at Adrian too long, I was afraid the argument would begin in front of Mira, and I refused to make her stand in the middle of another adult conflict about where she should live. Grant stayed near the boxes, visibly uncomfortable now that he understood I had not been included. He did not try to defend Adrian. He simply became very interested in the tape stuck to one of the flattened corners. Adrian told Mira she could finish her program in the den. Mira did not move. After a while, she turned back toward the screen, but she sat closer to the edge of the couch than before. That small change did more to me than shouting would have. I waited until she could not hear us clearly. Then I asked the question that had been sitting under every excuse Adrian had made for months. Why had she gone looking for a residential program before expanding the time Mira spent with Julian? Adrian's answer came quickly. She said this was not about convenience. Mira needed trained people who could provide consistency beyond what any one exhausted parent could manage. The program had structure built into every part of the day. There would be staff coverage, instead of one person becoming overwhelmed or unavailable. It was, in Adrian's words, a sustainable solution. Some of Adrian's argument was objectively reasonable. Residential support is not inherently cruel, and some families genuinely need it. My question was why she was considering it before honestly trying the obvious family alternative. More time with Julian, who had spent the previous year offering to help. I asked why the answer could not be more time with her father. Adrian's body changed before her face did. Her shoulders pulled back. One hand closed around the edge of the kitchen counter. The calm, professional explanation she had been giving me suddenly developed a crack. She said Julian's apartment was not designed around Mira. His work schedule had limits. He had his own life now. More importantly, she argued, Mira needed something beyond the improvised arrangement of one parent stepping in whenever another could not manage. I reminded her that Julian had managed for years. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Grant looked down. Adrian's eyes hardened. She said the residential program was not a punishment, and that she refused to let Julian turn a difficult decision into proof that she had failed. That was the first time she said it plainly enough that I could not pretend I had misunderstood. The threat was not only what the move might do to Mira or Phoebe, it was what giving Mira back to Julian would say about the custody battle Adrian had won. I asked whether Julian even knew she had started the intake process. Her jaw tightened again. She said she intended to tell him once there was something concrete to discuss. Under their joint legal custody order, a major change in Mira's living arrangement was not a decision Adrian could quietly finalize alone. I left the kitchen before anger made me reckless. Mira was still in the den. Phoebe had come in from the backyard and was kneeling near the coffee table with a handful of plastic animals. She arranged them beside Mira's blocks without being invited. Mira did not push them away. That image stopped me. The two girls did not know that the adults had begun discussing separate futures for them. Phoebe had no idea that her sister might soon be sleeping somewhere else. Mira had only been told she was getting a new home. I sat beside them for a while and said nothing. Later, after I left Adrian's house, I called Julian. I did not give him a dramatic version, because the facts were already dramatic enough. I told him Adrian had begun discussing a residential placement for Mira, and that from what I had seen, she had not merely been gathering general information. There had been an intake process and transition planning serious enough that Grant believed a move was coming. Julian went quiet. His silence lasted long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call had not dropped. When he finally spoke, he did not ask whether Adrian had lost her mind. He asked when Mira had been told. That was Julian. Even after being excluded from a decision about his own daughter, his first question was about what Mira had experienced. I told him about the words Adrian used. A new home. Another silence. He said he would contact his attorney that night. What followed over the next several days was mostly calls, written objections, and requests for information about the program. Julian made clear facts. He did not consent to a residential move, while less disruptive family options remained unresolved. The immediate result was a pause, but it stopped the placement from advancing while the adults sorted out what could happen next. Julian's first instinct was to take Mira. I understood why. She was his daughter. He had been the person who built most of her early routines. He knew how she slept, what she ate, which changes she could tolerate, and how quickly too many new demands could stack on top of one another. But his circumstances were not frozen. In the years before the divorce, his apartment had become a real home, but it was still smaller than Adrian's. His job was stable now, yet it required predictable daytime hours. Most importantly, moving Mira there immediately would mean changing several practical pieces at once. Her route to school would shift, some transportation arrangements would change, her therapy schedule would need reworking. The environment would be familiar because Julian was familiar, but it would not be the house she knew best outside Adrian's. My place was. That fact had happened almost accidentally. I lived close enough to Mira's school that she had already stayed with me overnight, without changing her morning routine. She knew which bedroom was hers when she came. She knew the hum of the refrigerator, the neighbor's dog that barked twice around 7, the lamp beside the bed, and which cabinet held the cereal she liked. I had never designed my home to become hers. It had simply become familiar through repetition. That made me uncomfortable, because familiarity suddenly carried legal and emotional weight. Julian could have turned that discomfort into a contest. He did not. We sat at my kitchen table one night after Mira and Phoebe had gone home with Adrian. Julian had a yellow legal pad in front of him, though he barely wrote on it. I had made coffee neither of us drank. He told me his attorney wanted a temporary plan while the residential issue was being resolved. Julian could ask for Mira to move directly to him. He had a strong argument based on his history and Adrian's attempt to change the child's living arrangement. Then he looked toward my hallway. Mira's overnight bag was still sitting beside the guest room door from her previous stay. Julian rubbed one hand over his jaw. Where is she safest right now? That question changed the room. Not who deserved her. Not who could win. Where she was safest. We talked through the realities rather than the insult. My house kept more of her day unchanged. Julian could still see her regularly. He could handle pickups, dinners, outings, and weekends, while we avoided throwing her through 3 new environments in a matter of weeks. It was not the outcome he had wanted years earlier. It was the outcome he chose now, because he had learned what custody fights could do when adults allowed pride to become the loudest need in the room. The temporary arrangement began before anyone had a perfect long-term answer. Mira came to stay with me. The practicalities arrived immediately. Being the aunt whose house a child slept in did not automatically give me authority to sign every school or medical form, so I completed the available relative caregiver paperwork as a short-term bridge, while the adults worked towards something more formal. Signing my name beneath caregiver made the situation feel real in a way the arguments had not. The first few days were harder than I expected. Mira knew my house, but knowing a house for an overnight was different from being told your things might remain there. She checked the front door more often. She carried one small bag from room to room. She asked about Phoebe without always using her name, sometimes pointing to a photograph instead. I learned quickly that the worst thing I could do was fill every silence because it made me nervous, so I stopped asking whether she was okay every 10 minutes. I stopped explaining the future when the adults had not finalized it. I gave her concrete information. Tonight she was sleeping here. Tomorrow Dad would pick her up after school. Phoebe would visit Saturday. No one was moving her anywhere else that week. Those were facts. Facts helped more than reassurance. Adrian remained involved in the legal discussions, though something strange happened once Mira was physically in my house. My sister became less urgent. When the possibility had been Julian taking Mira, Adrian had fought every suggestion. Once the alternative was me, much of that resistance softened. She still wanted to describe the arrangement as temporary. She still said professional placement might eventually be best, but she stopped behaving as though Mira living elsewhere was intolerable. That told me more than another argument could have. Losing daily care of Mira did not hurt Adrian in the same way losing to Julian would have. I hated what that realization did to the image of my sister I had carried since childhood. The longer-term solution came together slowly. Julian's attorney explained the limits of leaving Mira indefinitely with me under informal authority. If she was going to have her primary home in my house, I needed clear legal permission to deal with school, healthcare, services, and ordinary decisions without calling one of her parents every time a signature was required. The option that emerged was a guardianship of the person. The phrase frightened me at first. It sounded like replacing parents. That was not how the adults involved explained it. Julian and Adrian would remain Mira's parents. They would remain financially responsible. Julian would continue seeing her. Adrian would retain a relationship with her. The guardianship would give me the day-to-day authority necessary because Mira was actually living in my home. The most important part was that neither parent had to be erased for me to become responsible. Julian consented because the arrangement kept Mira's school, supports, and familiar environment more stable than an immediate transfer to his household. Adrian consented for reasons I did not entirely trust. She described it as a sensible family solution. I suspected another part was simpler. If Mira lived with me, Adrian could tell herself that no one had proven Julian the better parent. I did not challenge her on it then. Mira had already spent enough of her childhood inside adult scorekeeping. Before anything became formal, I insisted that someone actually ask her what she wanted. Not in a room full of lawyers. Not with Adrian and Julian staring at her. Not as if an 8-year-old should decide the legal structure of her own life. But she deserves some role in a decision about where she would wake up. We used the communication that worked for her, choices she understood. Pictures, short questions, time. She consistently chose my house as the place she wanted to sleep most nights. She still wanted Dad. She still wanted Phoebe. Those things were not contradictory. Adults liked clean categories. Children rarely lived in them. The guardianship process did not happen overnight, and I did not experience it as triumph. There were interviews, paperwork, explanations, and people making sure the arrangement was actually appropriate, rather than simply convenient for 3 adults exhausted by conflict. Through all of it, Mira lived with me. Julian remained steady. Adrian became strangely efficient about transferring practical information. Insurance remained through her employer while it was available. Financial responsibility did not magically disappear because Mira changed houses. Both parents contributed to her needs. I was not suddenly financing therapy, food, school supplies, and every other expense from my operations manager salary, as though legal parenthood had evaporated. That practical support mattered. It did not make the emotional reality lighter. One afternoon, I went with Mira to Adrian's house to collect more clothes and familiar things from my spare room. I had spent the previous week avoiding the word packing. It sounded too permanent. Adrian had already placed several empty boxes in Mira's room. Phoebe sat cross-legged on the carpet while we sorted clothes. She kept trying to put things into Mira's bag that Mira clearly did not want. A plastic bracelet, a tiny stuffed animal, a coloring book with most of the good pages already used. For the first time in days, the room felt almost normal. Phoebe complained that Mira was taking the blue blanket. Mira held tighter to the blanket. I told Phoebe that possession seemed to have been established by force. Phoebe responded by protecting a different blanket with her entire body. Mira's mouth moved at the corner. Not quite a laugh. Close enough. Then Phoebe ran downstairs because Grant had brought home ice cream. The room became quiet. I folded 2 shirts and put them into the bag. Mira opened Phoebe's small drawer beside the bed. Before I could tell her those were not her things, she took out the bright plastic bracelet Phoebe had been wearing almost every day that month. She put it into her own bag. I crouched beside her. I asked why she wanted Phoebe's bracelet. Mira kept looking at the open bag. Her fingers touched the bracelet once. So she knows where I am. I stopped moving. The shirt in my hand stayed half folded. All this time, the adults had been worrying about whether Mira understood that she was being moved. She understood something worse. She thought she was the one leaving. She thought Phoebe might need a marker to remember where her sister had gone. My throat tightened so suddenly I had to look away. I did not tell her mom was abandoning her. I did not tell her none of this was her fault. In some giant speech she had not asked for. I took the bracelet out of the bag, wrote my address on a small card, and placed them together. Then I told her Phoebe already knew where she was. That night, I lay awake listening to my house. The refrigerator clicked on. A car passed outside. Around midnight, floorboards shifted near the hall. When I opened my bedroom door, Mira was standing there holding her blue blanket. I moved aside. She did not climb into bed. She walked past me to the living room and sat in the chair nearest the front door. I brought another blanket and sat on the couch. Neither of us spoke. A few days later, Julian came for dinner. Mira had been watching the driveway long before his truck appeared, though every time I asked whether she was waiting for something, she ignored me. When his headlights finally moved across the front window, she stood. She did not run outside. She did not call his name. She went to the dining room instead, put both hands on one of the wooden chairs, and dragged it several feet across the floor until it sat closer to the entryway. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood. Julian opened the door a moment later. He stopped when he saw the chair. His face changed. Not dramatically. His hand simply stayed on the doorknob. Mira sat down and looked toward the floor. Julian swallowed. She used to do that when she was waiting for me. I looked at Mira. Sitting in the chair, she had moved closer to the door. For more than a year, adults had been building stories out of the times Julian was not there. Mira had been counting the times he tried to come. The guardianship became official a few months after Mira moved in with me. There was nothing triumphant about the process. No one handed me a document and declared that I had become the person who mattered most. The court wanted to know where Mira was living, why the arrangement had changed, whether both parents understood what they were agreeing to, and whether giving me day-to-day authority actually served her, rather than simply making life easier for the adults around her. A court investigator spoke with us. Forms passed through hands. Attorneys explained the limits of what the guardianship would and would not do. Julian and Adrian both consented. I became responsible for the ordinary legal decisions that had already begun filling my kitchen counter: school papers, routine medical care, permissions, services, transportation, the 1,000 signatures. No one notices until they belong to you. Julian did not stop being her father. Adrian did not stop being her mother. Both remained financially responsible. Adrian kept Mira on her employer health plan while it remained available. Julian contributed regularly and kept his time with her. The guardianship solved the problem of who could sign and decide when Mira was sleeping under my roof most nights. It did not rewrite biology, and it did not turn my house into evidence that somebody had won. I reminded myself of that often in the first year, because, privately, I was scared of failing in exactly the way I had criticized my sister for failing. I had spent months judging Adrian for treating care like something she could engineer from the outside. Then Mira moved in, and within 3 weeks I had built a system so elaborate it looked as though I was trying to launch her into orbit. There were laminated schedules on the refrigerator, a backup schedule inside a drawer, labels on bins, labels inside bins, a list of safe foods taped beside the pantry, a second list in my phone because I had convinced myself the paper version might somehow become unavailable during a cereal emergency. I had spare headphones in the house, car, work bag, and one drawer. I started calling the apocalypse drawer because it contained batteries, chargers, wipes, earplugs, crackers, bandages, and enough duplicate supplies to survive several minor natural disasters. Julian tolerated my system with the patience of a man who had spent years living with both Adrian and a preschooler. Maeve did not. She came by one afternoon while I was rebuilding the week's calendar, After Mira's school changed an early release day, I had papers spread across the dining table and small colored tabs marking transportation, appointments, Julian's time, and school events. Maeve stood over the table, looked at the colors, then looked at me. "Of course it has tabs," Julian said from the kitchen. Maeve told me she charged extra if the tabs were color-coded. They were. Mira, who was sitting on the floor nearby, assembling a line of wooden tiles, reached over without looking at me and peeled one green tab from the bottom of the page. I decided 3 people constituted a majority. The tab system became less ambitious after that. The months after the residential placement crisis could easily have become a story made entirely of damage. Mira still checked the door more than before and disliked packed bags, even when we were only going to Julian's for an afternoon. But she was not sad all the time. She still laughed, usually in the quick breath-through-the-nose way that meant something had genuinely caught her off guard, and she had a talent for exposing vague questions. I learned that after asking whether she was okay so often, the phrase became meaningless. For the first several weeks, I asked whether she was okay so often that the sentence became meaningless. I asked after school, after a schedule change, after dinner, before bed, when she went quiet, when she seemed tired, when she did not seem tired enough. One evening, probably around the 50th time I had asked that week, Mira looked up from the puzzle in front of her. "Define okay." I stared at her. She went back to the puzzle. From the kitchen doorway, Julian covered his mouth with one hand. I laughed before I could stop myself. It was not mockery. Mira knew it. Her mouth twitched too. After that, "Are you okay?" became a family warning that Paige had asked a question too vague to deserve an answer. I learned to ask better things. Was the room too loud? Did she want company or space? Did she want pasta or toast? Was she ready to leave in 5 minutes or 10? Would she rather Dad pick her up or meet him here? The choices were small, which was exactly why they mattered. For most adults, deciding which route to take home barely qualified as a decision. For Mira, there had been years when adults interpreted almost every preference through what they believed was best for her. Giving her control over ordinary things did not transform her overnight. It simply taught all of us that her preferences existed even when they were inconvenient. Sometimes she chose things I thought were bad ideas. That was harder. One rainy afternoon, she insisted on wearing a thin jacket because she liked the pockets. I tried to steer her toward the heavier one. When she refused, I started explaining the temperature, the forecast, and the probability of getting cold as if I were delivering weather testimony. Julian watched me for a minute. Then he asked whether she was in danger or merely likely to regret the jacket. That question irritated me because I knew exactly what he meant. Mira wore the thin jacket. She got cold. She accepted the heavier one I had put in the car. No civilization collapsed. That was one of the quiet lessons of those years. Protecting a child and eliminating every consequence from her life were not the same thing. Julian remained the person most capable of reminding me of that, because he had already spent years learning where care ended and control began. His presence in Mira's life became ordinary again after the guardianship, which was exactly what I wanted. There was no heroic return because he had never truly left. He picked her up. He attended school meetings when his work schedule allowed. He learned the new routines we developed in my house and told me when I was making one too complicated. He took Mira to the same park, the same small train exhibit when it returned, and eventually to places they had not tried before. He also annoyed her. That mattered. When people talked about Julian and Mira, they tended to turn their relationship into something tender and noble because he had once been her primary caregiver. Real fatherhood was messier. He forgot which water bottle she wanted one morning. He sang in the car when she wanted silence. He once changed the order of 2 errands without warning her, because he thought it would save 10 minutes and spent the next hour regretting the efficiency. Mira did not worship him. She trusted him. Those were different things. Phoebe came in and out of my house, through all of it. At 5, she treated the arrangement as if the adults had created an unnecessarily complicated sleepover. She wanted to know which toys could stay at my house, whether Mira still owned her room at Mom's, and whether she was allowed to eat the snacks I bought for Mira. As the months passed, visits became part of the rhythm. Some were tied to Julian's time. Some happened when Adrian allowed Phoebe to spend an afternoon or overnight with me. The sisters did not transform into sentimental little angels just because their households had separated. They still fought over markers, blankets, the remote, and whether Phoebe had touched something Mira had arranged. The favorite chair became the center of one of those battles. It was an ordinary upholstered chair near the window, positioned where Mira could see the front walkway without sitting directly beside the door. Phoebe decided it looked like a throne, and began calling it the throne, with the solemnity of someone naming a national monument. The first time Phoebe tried to sit in it, Mira stood in front of her until she moved. Phoebe declared that kings and queens were supposed to share. Mira informed her, with complete seriousness, that she was not the queen. The name stayed anyway. Years later, even after the fabric had faded and one arm developed a permanent dent, it was still the throne. That was the kind of thing I wished I could bottle when the harder parts arrived. Proof that childhood did not stop simply because adults had made a mess of the structure around it. Adrian continued seeing Mira, though less consistently than Julian. At first she came more often. She brought things from the old house and took Mira for meals or short outings she knew she could tolerate. Some visits went well. Others ended early. I never told Mira that any visit with her mother was supposed to feel a certain way. Adrian could still be warm with her. That complicated my anger. She remembered which dessert Mira liked at one restaurant. She once sat at my kitchen table helping with a school project for nearly 2 hours. Another time, she brought a soft cardigan because she had noticed Mira pulling at the collar of the one she wore. Those moments were real. So were the months when her schedule filled and visits became less frequent. People are easier to hate when every part of them agrees with your anger. Adrian never gave me that convenience. She loved Mira in ways I could see. She simply did not organize her life around that love, when doing so demanded something she did not want to give. Phoebe occupied a different place in her household. As she grew from 5 to 7 to 9, she became increasingly embedded in Adrian and Grant's life. Grant and Adrian married in 2018. By then, he was no longer the man standing awkwardly beside cardboard boxes, wondering whether he had said too much. He was part of Phoebe's everyday home. He was also careful with Mira when they visited. I never saw him treat her badly. If anything, he sometimes seemed overly hesitant, as if he worried one wrong move would prove he had no right to be there. Over time, that eased. The more difficult pattern came from Adrian. She kept creating 2 parallel explanations for the family. Around me, she described Julian as involved with Mira through the guardianship arrangement. Around Phoebe, the story shifted slightly. She would say Dad already had his time with Mira. She would imply that because Julian saw Mira at my house, or took her separately, he was focusing his attention there. When Phoebe asked why she was not included in some visit, Adrian often had a practical answer. She had school. She had plans. She had a birthday party. She had already promised to go somewhere with Adrian and Grant. Each explanation was plausible in isolation. The accumulated effect was not. Julian continued asking for both girls, whenever opportunities came up outside his regular schedule. Sometimes he got both. Sometimes he did not. Sometimes Adrian told him Phoebe already had plans, and he took Mira because refusing to see one daughter would not somehow create time with the other. The danger was in how that decision looked from Phoebe's side. She saw Dad leave with Mira. She did not see the message where he had asked for her too. From Phoebe's side, the pattern was simple. She saw Dad leave with Mira, but did not see the message where he had asked for her too. The truth existed in the co-parenting system, while Adrian's explanation lived in the child's day-to-day world, And for a long time, those versions did not collide. My bigger problem during those years was myself. After the residential placement crisis, I checked too much, confirmed plans twice, and mentally audited every overnight with Julian. Most of it looked like care, which made it harder to see when fear was doing the driving. The clearest example came when Mira wanted to attend a larger community fair with Julian. I started listing the noise, crowd, parking, and heat. He did not dismiss any of it. He asked what support she needed in order to try. Mira still wanted to go. I packed the headphones, not the entire emergency drawer. They stayed 40 minutes and came home with kettle corn. She disliked, but had insisted on buying because she liked the smell. That night, I removed another list from the refrigerator. The years did not become easy after that. They became fuller. Mira entered middle school. Her routines changed because she changed, not because adults had failed to preserve something. She developed stronger preferences about clothes and hated one haircut so much she refused to look at the photograph afterward. She became interested in practical maps and liked tracing bus routes even before she was old enough to ride them alone. She still needed support in ways that varied with stress and environment. Phoebe became more social, noisier, and increasingly aware that the family adults did not agree about the past. The sisters remained close, in a way that surprised people who expected the household split to turn them into strangers. They texted when Phoebe got her own phone. Mira preferred short messages and sent photographs with minimal explanation. Phoebe responded with too many emojis. When she came to my house, she still tried to sit in the throne occasionally, just to provoke a reaction. Mira still made her move. One winter evening, when Mira was around 13, and Phoebe 10, the girls were at my house eating grilled cheese at the kitchen counter. Julian was supposed to join us later, but work had delayed him. Phoebe had been complaining about having to split a school break between households. She was old enough now to notice which days she spent where, and young enough to assume the schedule reflected what adults wanted. She mentioned, almost casually, that Mom said Dad had mostly stopped asking for both girls together once Mira started living with me. My hand stopped over the sink. I did not turn around immediately. Phoebe kept talking, filling the silence with the version she had been given. Dad saw Mira through me. Mom said he had eventually stopped asking as much for Phoebe because their routines were different. Mira had been eating. She put the sandwich down. For several seconds, she stared at Phoebe. Then she said one word. No. Phoebe looked at her sister. The room changed. Not because Mira had raised her voice. Because she had contradicted a story Phoebe had been hearing for years. What do you mean, no? Phoebe's question hung over the kitchen counter between the two grilled cheese plates. What do you mean, no? Mira did not answer right away. At 13, she already understood more than most people gave her credit for. But understanding something and organizing it into words under pressure were still different tasks. Her eyes dropped to the corner of her sandwich. One finger pressed against the crust, then released. Phoebe waited longer than she would have when she was younger. That was one of the first signs that the girls were beginning to learn each other, instead of simply sharing a childhood. Mira finally said Dad had asked not once, many times. She did not explain dates or custody schedules. The correction alone was enough to disturb a story Phoebe had heard for years. Dad was busy. Dad already had time with Mira. Dad had stopped asking as much for Phoebe. I did not pull out the co-parenting messages or call Adrian a liar. Phoebe was 10, Mira was 13, and they were sisters, eating cold sandwiches in my kitchen, not witnesses. I told Phoebe only that the adults' schedules had sometimes been more complicated than she had been told. The question did not disappear after that. It matured with them. For the next several years, the question did not disappear. It simply matured with them. Mira changed in ways that made my old systems increasingly ridiculous. By 14, she used spoken language more consistently at home, but still preferred writing when she felt crowded or needed time to organize a thought. In unfamiliar settings, she sometimes used an AAC app on her phone because typing gave her control over pace. She could answer a direct question quickly and spend 10 minutes staring at someone who asked something vague, like how she felt about everything. She also had the driest sense of humor in the family. I remained her most frequent target. One morning when she was 16, she came downstairs wearing a jacket I had never seen before. She was planning to take a bus route with Maeve to practice getting across town independently. The route required one transfer and a 7-minute walk between stops. I had checked the weather, then checked it again. I had printed the bus map even though Mira already had it saved on her phone. I had written Maeve's number on a piece of paper, in case Mira's phone died, then put a portable charger in her bag, so that exact problem would not happen. When Mira reached the front door, I asked whether she was okay. She stopped, looked at me. Bad question. The phrase had become a callback between us. I corrected myself. I asked whether she wanted me to review the transfer point with her again. No. Did she have what she needed? Yes. Did she want Mira raised one eyebrow? I shut my mouth. Maeve, waiting outside, later told me that watching me learn restraint had become one of the longest-running entertainment programs of her career. I laughed when she said it. I also knew she was right. Protecting Mira had changed me. At first, that change had been necessary. After Adrian's residential plan, I had needed to become the adult who noticed things, asked questions, signed papers, and refused to let important decisions slide past simply because someone more confident said they were handled. The danger was that vigilance could become its own kind of authority. By the time Mira was 17, that problem had become harder to ignore. She wanted to begin a vocational program that combined classroom work with supported placements in local businesses. It was exactly the kind of next step we had talked about for years. Structured, practical, connected to something she enjoyed, and designed to increase independence rather than preserve dependence. My first reaction to the vocational program application was a private inventory of transportation, schedule changes, supervisors, and sensory load. I turned the packet over in my hands while Julian listened. I turned the application packet over in my hands while Julian sat across the table listening. He did not tell me I was being ridiculous. That would have made it easier to dismiss him. Instead, he asked whether Mira had said she wanted to do it. She had. Then he asked what part of my concern belonged to Mira and what part belonged to me. I hated that question, mostly because I knew the answer before I could defend myself. Some risks were real. The fear underneath them was mine. For 10 years, my identity had grown around keeping Mira safe, so the possibility that she might someday need me less did not feel as cleanly triumphant as I wanted it to. I signed the application anyway. The program brought difficult days and good ones. One placement needed a quieter schedule, another supervisor learned to give one instruction at a time. Mira was learning to live in a world that would not always be arranged for her, and I was learning not to arrange it before she had a chance to try. Phoebe's changes were louder. By 11, she had opinions about everything from shoes to music, to whether family dinners should require sitting at a table. By 13, she had friends I barely knew, school activities Adrian could not fully schedule around, and a developing ability to detect when adults were answering a different question from the one she had asked. That last skill caused problems. The version of Julian she had grown up hearing no longer matched the man she knew. He attended her school events. He remembered exams. He showed up for weekend plans, even when she changed her mind about them the night before. He had rebuilt a stable work life and home long ago. His house was not as polished as Adrian's, but Phoebe increasingly spent her regular parenting time there without treating it as some lesser version of home. The contradictions started with small memories. Phoebe remembered a weekend when Adrian had told her dad wanted special time with Mira. Mira remembered a juice bottle in Julian's cooler that had been meant for Phoebe. Phoebe remembered being told Dad could not make one exchange. I remembered seeing Julian waiting in the therapy center parking lot. Mira remembered his truck. Phoebe remembered Mom saying Dad had moved on. Mira remembered the chair she used to move toward the door when she was waiting for him. None of those memories proved an entire childhood by themselves. Together, they made Phoebe uneasy. She started asking Julian questions. He answered carefully. Too carefully sometimes. He still did not want to turn her against Adrian. He would explain that adult schedules and court orders had been complicated, that he had wanted both girls, and that there were times he had disagreed with decisions made in Adrian's house. He refused to label her mother a liar. That restraint frustrated Phoebe. But it also protected something important. He was not asking her to repair his reputation. She would have to decide what she believed from the record itself. By then, the record existed. Years of co-parenting communication had accumulated in the system. Julian began using more carefully after the first custody fight. He had kept it because his attorney told him to. Most of it was painfully ordinary. School pickups, summer schedules, doctor appointments, birthday weekends, transportation. Then there were the requests. Can I take both girls Saturday? I can cover the caregiver gap. I can pick up Phoebe too. Can she come with Mira? I'm available if you need childcare. The replies were often equally ordinary. Phoebe already has plans. That will disrupt the schedule. She has something with us. Mira can go, but Phoebe is committed elsewhere. None of it read like a conspiracy. That was what made the pattern so persuasive. Phoebe saw some of those messages for the first time when she was 14. Not because Julian dumped years of litigation evidence onto her, because she asked a specific question about a memory she could not reconcile, and he showed her the relevant exchange rather than asking her to trust him. One message became another, not hundreds. Enough. I watched her face change as she read. Phoebe had inherited Adrian's ability to move quickly through information, but that afternoon she slowed down. She reread dates. She checked which weekend she had thought Dad chose Mira. She found a message where Julian had explicitly asked for both girls. Adrian had replied that Phoebe already had plans. Phoebe stared at the screen for so long it dimmed. When she finally handed the phone back, she did not cry. She became quiet. Mira noticed. Later, the two sisters sat in the throne room by then. The chair had become so permanently associated with Mira that nobody remembered when we stopped calling it anything else and compared what they remembered. I stayed in the kitchen, close enough to hear if they needed me, far enough away that the conversation belonged to them. Phoebe talked more. Mira interrupted only when a detail was wrong. Phoebe remembered thinking Dad had preferred taking Mira because Mira needed him more. Mira remembered hearing him ask for both girls. Phoebe remembered Adrian telling her that complicated routines made shared visits difficult. Mira remembered waiting for Phoebe on outings that had never happened. There was no dramatic moment where both girls announced they had discovered the truth. It was slower, more painful. Phoebe was not learning that her mother had invented a stranger. She was learning that Adrian had edited real events until their meaning changed. That kind of betrayal is harder to dismiss because you can see how each sentence was built. Our mother's role in the past resurfaced during that same period. Patricia was 74 by then, and still capable of turning conflict into tea. Phoebe asked her one afternoon whether she remembered Julian being turned away from Adrian's house when the girls were young. Mom's face changed before she answered. I was there. That mattered. Patricia admitted she remembered at least one exchange clearly. Julian had arrived. Adrian had refused to send Mira because of routine concerns. Later, Adrian had told Phoebe a softened version that made it sound as though Dad simply could not take them. Phoebe asked why Grandma had never corrected it. Patricia's hands settled around her cup. She said she had not wanted to make things worse. I felt an old anger rise so cleanly that for a second I was back in 2016 watching her fold a napkin while telling me not to get in the middle. The difference was that this time, Phoebe was old enough to hear the answer for what it was. Silence had not kept her out of the conflict. It had only left one adult in charge of explaining it. Patricia did not defend herself much after that. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, morally. There are consequences that do not require anyone to punish you. Sometimes a teenager simply asks why you knew enough to feel uncomfortable but not enough to speak. No answer survives that question gracefully. Grant had begun changing too. By then, he and Adrian had been married for years. He was part of Phoebe's daily life, and had known Mira long enough to stop treating every interaction like a test he might fail. I still would not call him close to Mira, but they had their own functional familiarity. What shifted was his confidence in Adrian's version of Julian. He had believed what most people would have believed from the story he received. Julian had struggled after divorce. Adrian had primary custody. Mira needed extensive support. Paige became guardian. Julian stayed involved, but less centrally. Then Grant began seeing the messages and the older girl's questions. He did not suddenly accuse Adrian of manipulation. He simply stopped filling gaps in her favor automatically. I noticed it one night when Adrian made an offhand comment that Julian had always been inconsistent with Phoebe. Grant did not agree. He asked which period she meant. The question was mild. Adrian reacted as though he had challenged her publicly. That told me how much she had depended on people accepting the shortened version without asking what had been cut. Through all of this, there were still ordinary days. I am grateful for that, because memory can otherwise become unfair. It can compress years into nothing but the moments that hurt. There were summer afternoons when Mira and Phoebe sat on my floor arguing over movies. There were school projects, flu seasons, birthday cakes, Phoebe learning to drive with Julian and nearly destroying his nerves before she had even left the parking lot. Mira finding a coffee shop near her vocational program, where the same employee remembered her order without turning the familiarity into a performance. There was music. Julian had been playing the same collection of old songs in his car since before Phoebe could read. By 15, she considered this a human rights violation. One evening, the four of us were driving back from dinner when the opening notes of a song from the late 90s came through the speakers. Phoebe groaned and informed her father that nobody her age listened to this. Julian told her that sounded like a problem with her generation. From the back seat, Mira looked up from her phone. He's been saying that for 10 years. Phoebe laughed so hard she had to lean against the window. Julian accused Mira of betrayal. I watched the city lights slide across the glass and felt something loosen in me. Nobody in that car was proving anything. We were just going home. That ordinary stretch ended in early 2026. Adrian's career had continued rising. She was 48 and now being considered for a senior executive role with a healthcare organization headquartered in Seattle. The offer, when it came, was significant. More money, more authority, a broader portfolio. The kind of title Adrian had spent most of her adult life moving toward. I did not resent Adrian for wanting the promotion. Ambition was never the problem. The problem began when Phoebe became part of the package without being asked. Adrian approached the move the same way she approached everything important. She researched neighborhoods, schools, commutes, housing. She built a timeline. She calculated how often Phoebe could return to Sacramento and how Julian might use longer school break blocks. On paper, it was thoughtful. Phoebe still did not want to go. She was 15. Her school was in Sacramento. Her friends were there. Julian was there. Mira was there. I was there. Even Grant's routines had become tied to California, although his work gave him more flexibility than Adrian's new position would. Most importantly, Phoebe had stopped seeing herself as luggage. She listened to Adrian explain Seattle, then asked whether staying with Dad was an option. Adrian's response was immediate enough to concern me. She did not ask why Phoebe wanted to stay. She explained why moving would be better. Better schools, a stronger professional environment, safer housing, more opportunity, and regular flights back. Everything Adrian said could have belonged in a responsible relocation plan. None of it answered the question Phoebe had actually asked. Over the following weeks, the subject returned again and again. Phoebe did not become dramatic. That made Adrian's frustration worse. A teenager screaming that she hated her mother could be dismissed as teenage emotion. Phoebe was calm. She kept saying she wanted to stay. The more calmly she said it, the more Adrian looked for another explanation. The more calmly Phoebe said she wanted to stay, the more Adrian searched for another explanation. Julian must have influenced her. I must have encouraged it. Mira's history must have shaped her view. The possibility she seemed least willing to consider was that her 15-year-old had evaluated 2 lives and preferred one Adrian had not chosen. I recognized the old pattern returning in the posture before the words. Adrian had been younger during the first custody fight, but her body still did the same thing when she felt she was being challenged. Her shoulders straightened. Her speech became more precise. Every decision turned into a case she could build. Phoebe saw it too. One Sunday afternoon, we were all at Patricia's house for an early dinner. The Seattle move had become the subject everyone was trying not to mention, which meant it was present in every silence. Adrian finally said that once the job was finalized, they would have to start planning around a summer relocation. Phoebe put down her fork. Her hand was trembling slightly, but her voice was not. "If you move, I want to live with Dad." No one spoke. Patricia looked at her plate. Grant leaned back in his chair. Julian's face tightened, but he did not reach for the moment, as if Phoebe had handed him something he had been waiting to win. Mira looked at her sister. I looked at Adrian. For one heartbeat I saw hurt on Adrian's face. Then the familiar stillness and sharpened focus returned. She was no longer hearing only where Phoebe wanted to live. She was hearing that Julian might win. The second custody fight did not begin with shouting. It began with paperwork. Within weeks of Phoebe saying she wanted to stay with Julian, the Seattle offer became formal, and Adrian began planning around it, while the relocation question remained unresolved. She was free to move if she chose. The dispute was whether Phoebe's primary home should move with her. Adrian built a strong proposal: neighborhoods, schools, commute times, activities, health coverage, travel, and longer school break blocks with Julian. As in the first custody case, the danger was not that her facts were invented. It was what disappeared when only those facts were counted. Julian did not wait this time. The man who had once believed years of parenting would speak for themselves now understood that silence could be interpreted by whoever filled it first. He retained counsel immediately, formally opposed the move, and asked the court to modify physical custody if Adrian chose to relocate. He did not ask for Phoebe because Adrian was moving. He asked because Phoebe had said, clearly and repeatedly, that she wanted to remain in Sacramento, and because a move to Seattle would radically reduce the ordinary contact she already had with him. That difference mattered to him. I could see it in the way he prepared. He did not collect every bad thing Adrian had ever done and build a shrine to resentment. He documented the current schedule. He gathered school calendars, proof of his stable work hours, information about Phoebe's activities, the distance between his home and her school, and the parenting history that had existed for years. He also had something he had not had in 2015. A decade of written co-parenting communication. Not a secret archive, not a hidden recording. Just the kind of boring records that accumulate when two parents spend years trying to coordinate children through a court-approved system. Dates, pickups, requests, changes, makeup time, offers to take both girls. Replies that one child already had plans. Messages that looked insignificant until you compared them to the story Phoebe had grown up hearing. I watched Julian review some of those communications at my kitchen table one evening. He did not look satisfied. That surprised me. For years, I had imagined that if we ever proved what Adrian had done, Julian would finally feel vindicated. Instead, he looked tired. Winning the argument that you had not abandoned your children required admitting they had spent years believing you might have. There was no version of that truth that felt like victory. Phoebe understood the stakes more clearly than anyone wanted her to. At 15, she was old enough to know the court would care what she wanted, but young enough that the adults still had an obligation not to turn her into a witness for one parent against the other. Julian was careful about that. His lawyer explained that Phoebe's views could be presented in a protected way appropriate for her age, rather than forcing her into an open confrontation where she would have to choose between her parents while both watched. I did not attend those private conversations. I only knew what Julian later told me and what Phoebe chose to share with me herself. She was not asking the court to punish Adrian. That was important. She still loved her mother. She did not deny that Seattle offered things she might enjoy. She did not claim Julian's house was better because it was bigger or richer or easier. She wanted to stay because Sacramento was her life. School. Friends. Her father. Mira. Me. The places she had known long enough to stop noticing them. At 15, belonging had become something Phoebe could name. Adrian heard it as something someone else had taught her to say. That was where the old pattern began showing itself again. At first, the changes were small. Adrian started questioning how often Julian and Phoebe spoke outside scheduled parenting time. She complained that discussions about Seattle were happening in his house without her. She told Phoebe she needed space from pressure while the case was pending. One evening, Julian tried to call during a time they had regularly spoken for years. The call went unanswered. Later, Adrian messaged through the co-parenting system that Phoebe needed a break from discussing the case. Julian replied that he had not called to discuss the case. He had called because Phoebe had a chemistry test the next morning, and he had promised to check whether she wanted help reviewing. There was no response until the next day. Another week, an exchange that should have happened under the existing order was delayed after Adrian said Phoebe was too upset to transition. Julian requested the makeup time in writing. Adrian offered a shorter period several days later. A single incident would have meant little. Children really do get upset. Schedules really do change. Parents sometimes make bad calls without launching a conspiracy. But I had seen these building blocks before. Routine, stability, pressure, confusion. Every word sounded protective. Together, they created a gate. This time, Julian did not stand outside it quietly. He documented the missed exchange, contacted his attorney, and followed the process available to him, rather than waiting months for the pattern to become impossible to untangle. That was one of the biggest changes in him. The old Julian had believed that escalating conflict automatically harmed the children. The older Julian understood that sometimes refusing to address repeated interference merely allowed one adult to control the shape of the conflict while appearing calm. He still did not fight in front of Phoebe. He simply stopped confusing passivity with peace. Adrian noticed. The tone of her messages changed. She began describing Julian as increasingly aggressive about the schedule. She said Phoebe was being pulled into adult issues, and that his resistance to Seattle had given their daughter permission to reject what could be a major opportunity. I read some of those messages because Julian showed them to me. Adrian's messages read less like someone fabricating evidence than someone whose interpretation had hardened until every disagreement proved itself. Julian opposed the move, so he was influencing Phoebe. Phoebe did not want to go, so someone had influenced her. Mira questioned old family stories, so years with Julian and me had shaped her memory. The explanation always preserved Adrian as the person seeing things clearly. Mira saw the pattern before I told her anything. She was 18 now, legally an adult, and increasingly protective of the distinction between being supported and being managed. The first time she brought up the case, we were sitting in my living room. She had come home from her vocational program, tired, and had changed into an old sweatshirt before eating half a bowl of cereal at an hour. No sensible person would call dinner. My phone had buzzed several times with messages from Julian about a scheduling problem. I turned it face down. Mira had already seen my expression. She asked whether Mom was saying Phoebe was confused. I looked at her. That word had appeared in one of Adrian's recent messages. I had not repeated it. Mira had heard versions of it herself. Adrian had spoken to her earlier that week and told her she hoped Mira would not let other people pull her into something that could overwhelm her. She had framed the whole dispute as something Mira should stay away from for her own protection. Mira stirred the cereal without eating. Then she said Mom had done this before. I asked what she meant, careful not to turn her answer into the one I expected. Mira said that when she was younger, adults used words like routine and difficult whenever Dad wanted something Mom did not want. The sentence was simple. The connection was not. For years, I had treated the manufactured absence as a story about Julian. Mira understood it as a story about language. Words that sounded neutral had been used to decide whose version counted. Now, the vocabulary around Phoebe was influenced, pressured, and confused. Around Mira, it was vulnerable, overwhelmed, and easily shaped. I knew where that could lead before Mira said what she wanted. She wanted to speak in court. My first instinct was to protect her from stress, broad questions, and attacks on memory. Then I had to ask the question I had spent years learning not to replace with my own fear. Did Mira want to do it? She did. Julian had not asked her. And neither had I. Phoebe had grown up believing Dad chose Mira over her, and Mira knew from her own experience that was wrong. Julian was hesitant because he did not want his daughter carrying his case. His attorney drew a narrower line. Julian's current fitness and bond with Phoebe could be proved without Mira. What Mira could offer was only her first-hand experience, what she heard, what she remembered about requests for both girls, and what was said afterward. The court could decide what weight to give it. Julian was hesitant when he learned. He told me privately that he did not want Mira carrying his case for him. That phrase stayed with me because it showed how different the second custody fight was from the first. In 2015, Julian had failed partly because he would not convert parenting into evidence. Now he had evidence. And still, he did not want his daughter turned into it unnecessarily. His attorney drew a line between the two things. Julian did not need Mira to prove that he currently had a stable home or a meaningful relationship with Phoebe. Those facts existed independently. Mira could offer something narrower. Her own experience. What she had directly heard. What she remembered about the requests for both girls. What Adrian had said afterward. The court could decide what weight to give that testimony. That was more defensible than turning Mira into a symbol. Adrian saw it differently. Adrian attacked the idea without directly attacking Mira. She emphasized stress, communication under pressure, the possibility that memory had been influenced by years with Julian and me, and the risk of pulling Mira into litigation. Each concern could sound protective by itself. Together they asked everyone to doubt Mira before she had spoken. It was the old problem in a new form. Adrian had once used autism to justify speaking for Mira, and now she was using it to question whether Mira's own memory should carry ordinary weight. There was one conversation between Adrian and me during that period that I almost wish had become a screaming fight. It would have been easier. Instead, she asked me whether I understood what I was doing by encouraging Mira to testify. I told her Mira had made the decision herself. Adrian gave me the kind of tired look people use when they believe you are being naive. She said Mira trusted me, and that meant my influence mattered, whether I acknowledged it or not. That part struck somewhere uncomfortable because it was true. That point was uncomfortable because Adrian was right about one thing. I did influence Mira, as every caregiver influences the person they live with. So did Julian, Maeve, and Adrian. The question was whether influence erased memory. I did not argue through every possibility. I prepared myself to do the harder thing. Let Mira decide what she wanted to say without helping her say it. That was harder than it sounds. Before the hearing, there were meetings about accommodations, and how Mira might communicate most effectively if she testified. She preferred direct questions, extra processing time, and the option to refer to written notes she had prepared for herself rather than being rushed into answering vague questions. I wanted to help. Of course I did. At home one evening, Mira sat at the dining table with a notebook open in front of her. The page held short phrases and dates, not a speech. She was trying to organize what she remembered so that stress would not jumble the sequence. I sat across from her. My entire body leaned toward the old habit of fixing. I almost told her which incident to start with. I almost suggested she mention the train exhibit because I remembered the second juice bottle. I almost reminded her that Adrian had told Phoebe Dad wanted special time with Mira. Every detail was true. That did not make it mine to place in her mouth. I stopped. The silence felt unnatural. Mira looked up. I asked whether she wanted help organizing the dates. She shook her head. I asked whether she wanted me to listen while she reviewed them. Another no. So I made tea. That was all. 10 years earlier, I had believed protecting Mira meant standing between her and everyone who might make the wrong decision. Now, protection required letting her make one I could not control. The legal preparation around us continued. Julian's side kept the current facts first. His stable home and work, Phoebe's ties to Sacramento, and Adrian's credible Seattle plan. The older messages, recent exchange problems, Maeve's direct observations, and Patricia's limited knowledge were relevant only insofar as they showed how each parent had handled the other parent's relationship with the girls. None of it was meant to turn the move-away case into a second trial of the divorce. Grant became quieter as the hearing approached. He was still Adrian's husband. He still supported the promotion. I never expected him to become our ally simply because he had begun seeing cracks in her version. But he stopped automatically repeating her claims. When she said Julian had spent years preferring Mira, Grant no longer nodded. When she said Phoebe had only begun talking about staying after Julian started opposing the move, Grant reminded her that Phoebe had been resisting Seattle from the beginning. Those were not dramatic betrayals. They were refusals to participate in simplification. For Adrian, that was enough to feel disloyal. Phoebe withdrew from most discussion of the hearing at home. I could not blame her. She had already told the appropriate professionals what she wanted. She was tired of being asked to justify it. One afternoon, she came to my house and went straight to the throne. Mira stood in front of her. For a second, I thought we were about to reenact a 10-year-old argument. Phoebe looked up. Mira said, "Still not allowed." Phoebe slid sideways onto the arm. Mira considered that compromise acceptable. I watched them sit there shoulder to shoulder, one technically occupying the chair, and the other technically violating every rule associated with it. That ordinary stubbornness steadied me. The case belonged to adults. The consequence belonged to them. That was exactly why their voices mattered. 2 days before the hearing, Adrian came to my house. She had dropped off a small box of Mira's old things she had found while reorganizing a closet. There was no dramatic purpose behind the box. Childhood has a way of leaving itself in other people's storage. Mira was not home. She was at her program. Adrian remained near the front entry instead of coming farther inside. Her eyes settled briefly on the throne, then moved toward the dining room where Mira had been organizing her notes. I knew what she wanted to discuss before she started. She told me she still thought allowing Mira to testify was a mistake. I said very little. Adrian kept her voice low. She talked about stress, vulnerability, communication under pressure, and the possibility that Mira would be forced to relive things she did not fully understand as a child. The language was careful, protective, familiar. Then Adrian looked at me with something almost like accusation. "You know Mira freezes under pressure. Don't put her through this." 10 years earlier, my sister had looked at the same child and treated her limited speech as permission to decide what kind of home she needed. Now, Mira was 18. She had chosen to speak, And Adrian was still trying to turn the way her daughter communicated into a reason someone else should decide whether her voice counted. By the morning of the hearing, the case had become thick enough to fill 2 bankers' boxes and still leave half the story outside them. As we moved through courthouse security, I kept thinking about what paper could and could not hold. It could show where a child slept, who requested time, and when an exchange changed. It could not reproduce the scrape of the chair Mira once dragged toward my front door while waiting for Julian, or the ease with which 5-year-old Phoebe accepted Dad couldn't come, because that was the explanation an adult gave her. Mira sat beside me in the courthouse hallway with her notebook closed on her lap. She had dressed carefully, but not formally enough to look like someone had put her in costume for court. She had chosen the clothes herself. Her phone was in her bag. Her notes were short. Dates, names, fragments she wanted available if stress disrupted the order of things. I asked if she needed anything. She looked at me. I caught myself before asking the question that had annoyed her for years. Water? She nodded. That was all. Julian stood near the window farther down the hall. He had aged in ways I noticed only when he was still. There was gray at his temples now. His shoulders had broadened from years of physical work, but that morning they were held too carefully, as if he were trying not to occupy more space than necessary. Phoebe was not sitting with us. Her preference had already been communicated through the protected process. She wanted to remain in Sacramento and, if Adrian moved, live primarily with Julian near her school, friends, Mira, and the life she already knew. That mattered, but it did not decide the case by itself. Adrian arrived with Grant and her attorney. She looked composed. I had expected that. Adrian had built a career out of staying functional when other people became visibly uncomfortable. Her suit was dark and simple. Her hair was pulled back. She carried a slim folder and nothing else. If someone had walked into the hallway without knowing us, they would have seen a successful executive preparing to make a difficult case for an important career move. That version was true. The problem was that it was not the only version. Grant sat behind her once we were inside. He did not look toward me. I did not know what Adrian had told him about the final strategy. I knew only that over the previous months, he had stopped automatically supporting claims he could no longer reconcile with what he had seen himself. That mattered emotionally. Legally, it barely mattered at all. The hearing began with the present. That was deliberate. Julian's attorney did not ask the court to punish Adrian for the marriage or retry what happened in 2015. The judge was deciding where Phoebe should live now if Adrian relocated, not whether every old decision had been wrong. Adrian's side presented the Seattle plan first. It was exactly as strong as I knew it would be. The job represented a major promotion. The compensation was better. The organization had long-term opportunity. Adrian had researched neighborhoods and schools. She had considered travel costs and proposed extended holiday blocks with Julian. She had a plan for maintaining contact through calls, flights, and school breaks. Nothing about the proposal was careless. Listening to it, I understood again why people had believed her so easily during the first custody fight. She knew how to build a life on paper. The harder question was, what happened when the people living inside that plan wanted something different? Adrian's attorney emphasized that relocation was not an attempt to separate Phoebe from Julian. The move was framed as a professional opportunity with benefits for the household and a reasonable plan to preserve the father-daughter relationship across distance. There was truth in that, too. Adrian had never said she wanted Julian erased. She had always preferred something subtler, a relationship that existed on terms she could control. Julian's current circumstances came next. The contrast with 2015 was impossible to miss. His job was stable. His housing had been stable for years. His schedule had predictable flexibility. Phoebe had an established room, routines, school access, and a long history of ordinary parenting time with him. He knew her teachers, activities, medical information, friends, and the thousand minor details that accumulate when a parent has actually been present. He was not asking to uproot her. He was asking to let her remain where she already was. That mattered more than the size of either house. So did the distance. Seattle was not an extra 20-minute drive. The move would transform ordinary parenting into travel. Midweek dinners would become impossible. School events would require flights or long planning. A missed connection would mean more than arriving late for pickup. The type of relationship Julian and Phoebe currently had could not simply be reproduced through longer summer blocks. The judge asked questions. The attorneys answered. Most of the exchange was procedural enough that I stopped trying to retain every sentence. What mattered was the shape of the inquiry. The court was looking at Phoebe's age, her current connections, the proposed move, each parent's ability to meet her needs, and how realistically each parent would support her relationship with the other. That last part was where the past entered the room, not as revenge, as prediction. If one parent was asking the court to trust that a long-distance relationship would be protected, then history mattered. The co-parenting messages came in groups rather than as a theatrical reveal. Read chronologically, they showed Julian repeatedly asking for both girls, offering to cover care gaps and requesting makeup time. Adrian's replies often said Phoebe already had plans, or that paid care was already arranged. None of those messages announced a plan to alienate anyone. Their weight came from comparison with the later claim that Julian had simply allowed his relationship with Phoebe to diminish. Adrian's side correctly pointed out that declining extra time was not automatically interference. The stronger examples were ordered exchanges, and repeated use of paid care despite the first refusal provision. The court was being asked to distinguish ordinary co-parenting disagreement from a pattern that affected access. Maeve testified only to what she had actually witnessed. I was grateful for that. Too much family drama turns witnesses into people who somehow know every motive in the room. Maeve never pretended to. She described her work in Adrian's house in 2015 and 2016. She remembered more than one occasion when Julian was available to care for the girls during a block for which she was hired. She remembered hearing Adrian acknowledge that availability and still choosing paid care. She remembered Julian's familiarity with Mira's routines when he did appear. She did not call Adrian cruel. She did not say who deserved custody. She answered what she knew and stopped. That made her testimony stronger. Patricia's history appeared more cautiously. Her clearest usefulness was the denied exchange she had personally witnessed years earlier. Julian arrived. Adrian declined to send Mira because of routine concerns. Later, Phoebe received a version suggesting Dad simply could not take them. Mom did not have 10 years of secret knowledge. She had one uncomfortable fact. She had spent 10 years trying not to make important. The court could decide what that meant. So could Phoebe. The more difficult testimony involved the present interference. The unanswered call before Phoebe's chemistry test, the delayed exchange, the shortened makeup time. Adrian's written insistence that Phoebe needed distance from pressure during litigation. Her attorney argued that Adrian had been responding to a teenager under stress, not deliberately undermining the father-daughter relationship. Julian's side argued that the same method had appeared before. Restrict contact, describe the restriction as protective, then use the resulting distance as proof that greater restriction was necessary. I looked at Mira when that argument was summarized. Her fingers pressed against the edge of her notebook. She understood that pattern without legal language. She had lived inside it. Phoebe's preference entered the case without forcing her into the room. The judge made clear that a 15-year-old's wishes mattered, but did not end the inquiry. A teenager could prefer one parent for reasons that had little to do with long-term welfare. A child's preference had to be weighed with maturity, context, and the rest of the evidence. That was exactly what I wanted. Not because I doubted Phoebe. Because I wanted her voice treated as a factor in her life, not as a weapon somebody could wave around. What came back from the protected process was consistent. Phoebe was not rejecting her mother. She did not say Adrian was dangerous. She did not claim Seattle was terrible. She wanted to stay. Her reasons were specific and age-appropriate. School, friends, her established relationship with Julian, proximity to Mira, the life she knew. She worried that long-distance travel would turn her father into someone she saw on vacations rather than during ordinary weeks. That last point hurt Julian enough that he looked down. Ordinary weeks. That was what custody cases so often turned into arithmetic. Nights, weekends, holidays. But children built attachment out of things too small to schedule as special occasions. A ride after school, help with chemistry, a bad playlist, stopping for milk because the refrigerator was empty. No airport itinerary could replace all of that by promising more days in July. Adrian answered by arguing that Julian's resistance to the move and the amount of time Phoebe spent with Julian, Mira, and me had affected the teenager's thinking. Then the argument widened toward Mira. Adrian emphasized vulnerability to stress, communication differences, and the possibility that memory had been shaped by years of other people's interpretations. I felt my hands tighten in my lap. The same diagnosis once used to justify deciding for Mira was now being used to question what she might say about those decisions. Mira's name was called later that afternoon. She stood without looking at me. I had promised myself I would not nod, smile, encouragement, mouth instructions, or make any other tiny gesture she might feel obligated to follow. So I kept my hands folded. Mira walked forward carrying her notebook. She was 18. That fact seemed simple until I remembered the 8-year-old child sitting in Adrian's den while adults discussed a new home she did not understand. The court accommodated the way she communicated best. Questions were kept direct. She was given time. Her notes were available to help with sequence rather than to supply a rehearsed speech. At first, the testimony was almost painfully ordinary. She identified relationships. She described living with Adrian before moving to my house. She described Julian visiting and asking for time. She remembered particular exchanges, not because she understood custody law at 8, but because routines mattered to her and departures were memorable. The train exhibit came up, not because I had told her to use it. She remembered that Julian had expected Phoebe too. She remembered an extra drink. She remembered being told Phoebe had plans. Another incident followed. Dad asked for both. Mira went. Phoebe did not. Later, Phoebe was told the visit had been for Mira. The room became very still. Adrian's side tested the limits of those memories. Had Mira understood every adult conversation? No. Did she know everything Adrian and Julian discussed privately? No. Had Paige talked with her about these events over the years? Yes, sometimes. Had Julian? Sometimes. Those answers did not destroy anything, because Mira never claimed omniscience. She stayed inside what she knew. That was the difference. She did not say why Adrian made every decision. She said what she heard, what she saw, what she remembered. At one point, the questioning became too broad, and Mira paused for a long time. I could feel my old instinct trying to pull me out of the chair. Help her, clarify, protect. I did nothing. Mira looked down at her notes. Then back up. The next question was narrowed. She answered. The pause did not make her less credible. It simply looked like processing. Exactly what it was. Eventually, the central issue came into focus. Adrian's position had long been that Julian's involvement with Phoebe became less consistent after Mira moved to my house. Mira had lived inside those years from the other side. She remembered Dad asking for both girls. She remembered Mom saying no to Phoebe's participation. She remembered how the story changed afterward. Nobody asked Mira for a speech. Thank God. The strongest thing she did was refuse to decorate the truth. Her hands rested flat on the table. She looked toward the person asking the question rather than toward Adrian. Dad didn't stop asking. She paused. You kept saying no. Another pause. Then you told Phoebe he chose me. That was it. 3 short sentences, no accusation about the whole marriage, and no speech about punishment. Adrian's face went white. Mira had been speaking for years. What changed was that Adrian could no longer decide what her daughter's silence meant. The rest of the hearing continued after that, because real courts do not stop when someone says a powerful line. There were questions about timing, parenting arrangements, school continuity, transportation, the Seattle proposal, and what would happen under each possible outcome. The judge did not announce that Mira had solved the case. By the time arguments closed, the record was broader than any one person. Phoebe's mature preference, her Sacramento ties, the distance of the proposed move, Julian's established home and current parenting role, Adrian's legitimate career opportunity, the history of access disputes, the written requests, the difference between declining extra time and interfering with ordered time, the repeated difficulty supporting Julian's relationship with the girls when doing so conflicted with Adrian's preferred plan. When the ruling came, it was measured enough that nobody could honestly call it revenge. Adrian was not forbidden to move. The court had no business deciding where a 48-year-old executive was allowed to live. What the court decided was where Phoebe would primarily live if her mother relocated. The move with Phoebe was denied. If Adrian accepted the Seattle position and moved, Phoebe's primary physical residence would shift to Julian under a transition schedule. Adrian would retain defined parenting time, including longer school break blocks and structured travel arrangements. The existing communication expectations were tightened. Exchanges and makeup time would be clearer. The court made it obvious that future interference would not be treated casually. There was also discussion of fees tied to parts of the litigation, and conduct the court found unnecessary or inconsistent with prior orders. Nothing criminal, nothing theatrical, no handcuffs, no destruction of Adrian's career. Just consequences connected to what had actually been proven. I looked at Julian. He did not smile. He closed his eyes for a second. Then he exhaled. That was all. Years earlier, Adrian had walked out of court with primary custody and treated the result like proof that her way of building a family was superior. Julian did not make the same mistake. The ruling did not make him the better human being. It meant the court believed Phoebe's best interests were better served by staying in Sacramento with him if Adrian chose Seattle. Nothing more, nothing less. Mira returned to the bench beside me after her testimony. I did not tell her she had been brave. I had learned enough to know how easily praise could turn someone's choice into a performance. I asked whether she wanted water. She did. We sat there until the hearing ended. Outside the courtroom, people separated into small groups the way families do after decisions too large to absorb in one place. Julian went to speak briefly with his attorney about the transition details. Grant stayed several steps behind Adrian. I was standing beside Mira when my sister approached. For the first time that day, Adrian's control looked thin. Not gone. Thin. Her eyes were red around the edges, though I had not seen her cry. Her folder was tucked tightly under one arm. She looked at Mira, not me. There were a dozen things she could have said. She could have asked whether Mira was exhausted. She could have asked whether she wanted space. She could have said she disagreed with the testimony, but understood it belonged to her daughter. Instead, the old scoreboard appeared one last time. After everything I did for you, this is what you chose? Mira did not answer immediately. And standing there in the courthouse hallway, I understood that the final question was no longer whether Adrian had lost a custody case. It was whether she could hear a choice without turning it into betrayal. Mira looked at Adrian for several seconds, after my sister asked whether this was what she had chosen, after everything Adrian had done for her. The courthouse hallway had emptied enough that I could hear the soft buzz of the lights overhead. Julian was still speaking with his attorney near the far windows. Grant stood behind Adrian, close enough to be part of the moment but not close enough to rescue it. I felt every old instinct in me tighten the need to explain, defend, soften, translate. Mira did not need me to explain, defend, or soften anything. She adjusted the strap of her bag and told Adrian she had chosen to answer a question. Then she asked whether we could leave. We did. 10 years earlier, I would have wanted the confrontation to continue until someone apologized correctly or admitted the exact truth. By then, I understood how rarely real family damage ended that cleanly. The ruling did not transform Phoebe's life overnight. There were transition dates, school logistics, transportation, and a revised parenting schedule. Adrian remained her mother with defined parenting time. Julian became the primary residential parent if she relocated. The change happened through ordinary planning rather than a courthouse handoff. Phoebe packed in stages. The first box held school things and clothing she needed immediately. The second carried books, photographs, chargers, and several objects that seemed pointless, until I remembered that children do not organize home the way adults do. A dried corsage from a school dance, a chipped mug, a sweatshirt she had stolen from Julian, and somehow brought back to Adrian's house months earlier. She refused to pack everything at once. Part of her still lived there. Adrian was still her mother. Nobody sensible expected a court order to erase that. The first evening Phoebe slept at Julian's under the new primary schedule, I went over only because she invited me. Julian had cleaned the room twice. I could tell, because the second attempt had made it less comfortable. Phoebe walked in, looked at the neatly arranged bed and empty surfaces, and immediately began ruining them. Shoes landed near the closet instead of inside it. A hoodie went over the chair. Her phone charger crossed the desk at an angle that would have bothered Adrian on sight. Julian watched the mess spread and said nothing. I could see him wanting to smile. He had waited years for ordinary clutter. Phoebe noticed. She warned him not to make the moment weird. He looked away and carried the empty box downstairs. That was about as sentimental as either of them could tolerate. Adrian still had to decide what to do with Seattle. The promotion itself had never been taken away. The court had only refused to make Phoebe part of the relocation. After several weeks of discussions with the company, she formally confirmed that she would take the role and began splitting time while preparing for a fuller move. I was surprised by how angry the decision made me at first. Some part of me had wanted her to reject the job as proof that she had finally learned something. That was unfair. Ambition was never the moral failure. The failure had been treating every other person's preference as something that should bend around hers. Flights replaced commutes. Adrian missed a school event after a delay, had to schedule calls instead of walking down the hall, and lost pieces of weekends to travel problems. Julian did not impose those consequences. They were simply what long-distance parenting looked like. I never needed to point out the irony. Phoebe felt it more painfully than anyone. She was relieved to remain in Sacramento, but relief did not protect her from missing her mother. There were nights when she resented Adrian for leaving, and mornings when she defended the promotion because she knew what it meant to her. Sometimes both happened in the same conversation. I learned not to correct the contradiction. A teenager could want to stay with her father and still wish her mother had stayed too. That was not inconsistency. That was love refusing to become simple just because the legal case was over. Grant became the first person in Adrian's household to establish a boundary she could not explain away as Julian's influence. He did not leave immediately. That would have been too easy. He had built a marriage with Adrian, and he had spent years helping raise Phoebe. He also had his own work and commitments in California, which meant the Seattle transition affected him too. What changed was his willingness to repeat claims he no longer believed. Adrian wanted to continue describing the hearing as Julian using the girls against her. Grant would not. I learned that from him directly several weeks after the ruling, when he came by to drop off something Mira had left at Adrian's house years earlier and recently asked for. He did not give me private details of their marriage. He only said that he had told Adrian he would support her decisions, But he would not tell Phoebe that Julian had caused the move-away ruling, or tell Mira that her testimony was the product of manipulation. He had been present long enough now to know those claims were not fair. That boundary had consequences inside their marriage. Adrian experienced disagreement as withdrawal. Grant had spent years assuming her confidence meant she had the fuller version of events. Now, for the first time, he was asking what confidence could conceal. They stayed together. At least then, their relationship became quieter around us, which told me enough. Patricia had a different reckoning. Mom could not blame a job or a court order for hers. Phoebe asked her one afternoon why she had never corrected the story about Julian when she knew some of the exchanges had been blocked. I was there when it happened. Patricia had invited us over for lunch, clearly hoping enough time had passed for the family to begin behaving normally again. That was her favorite form of healing. Food, neutral conversation, and the belief that if everyone stayed seated long enough, pain might become impolite to mention. Phoebe did not cooperate. She waited until plates had been cleared. Then she asked. Mom's fingers stopped against the edge of a serving dish. She gave the same explanation she had used years earlier. She had not known everything. She did not want to take sides. She thought the parents would work it out. She worried that contradicting Adrian in front of the children would make things worse. Every sentence contained some truth. None answered the question. Phoebe listened until Patricia finished. Then she asked why knowing enough to be uncomfortable had never been enough to make Grandma say something. There was no good response. Patricia looked down at the dish in her hands. For years, I had thought justice required loud consequences. That afternoon showed me another kind. My mother had spent most of her adult life believing neutrality protected relationships. Now her granddaughter looked at her differently because of it. No judge ordered that. No one needed to. Social consequences were often just trust changing shape. Phoebe did not cut Patricia off. She simply stopped treating Grandma's silence as wisdom. The relationship continued. It was less innocent. That was earned. The hardest repair happened between the sisters. For years, both girls had carried a private version of the separation that made the other one seem more chosen. Phoebe believed Julian had gradually centered Mira. Mira believed she had been the child whose needs broke the family into different households. Neither belief had come entirely from one sentence. That was what made them so difficult to uproot. One Saturday afternoon, a few weeks after the hearing, I found them sitting on the floor of Mira's room with an open plastic storage bin between them. We had been sorting old-school papers because Mira wanted to clear space before starting the next stage of her vocational program. The bin contained construction paper projects, old visual schedules, birthday cards, and a menu from the bakery Mira used to like. At the bottom lay the cheap plastic bracelet she had taken from Phoebe's drawer the day we packed her things in 2016. I recognized it immediately. Phoebe did not. Mira did. Eventually, Mira explained why she had taken it. So you knew where I was. Phoebe's face folded before she made a sound. She covered her mouth with one hand and stared at the bracelet in Mira's palm. For most of her childhood, Phoebe had understood Mira's departure through the explanation available to a 5-year-old. Mira needed more help and Aunt Paige could provide it. She admitted she had sometimes wondered whether Mira had wanted to leave them. Mira shook her head and admitted the belief she had carried in the other direction, that everyone had to rearrange schools, schedules, caregivers, and houses because of her. Phoebe moved closer. Neither sister turned the moment into forgiveness for the adults. That was not what they needed from each other. Phoebe told Mira she had never blamed her. Mira said she knew that now. The bracelet stayed between them for a while. Then, Phoebe fastened it around her own wrist. It barely fit. She wore it anyway. Later that evening, I noticed Mira had left the storage bin open and the bracelet box empty. For once, I did not organize either one. Summer came. Life became irritating in ordinary ways again. Julian's house absorbed more of Phoebe's belongings, until the room stopped looking staged. Adrian flew back on scheduled weekends. Sometimes the visits went well. Sometimes Phoebe returned angry because Adrian had spent too much time talking about Seattle. Sometimes Adrian returned angry because Phoebe would not consider transferring schools after another year. There was no instant cure for control, but there were boundaries now. Julian kept the communication formal when it needed to be, and ordinary when it did not. He did not use the new custody arrangement to retaliate. When Adrian had legitimate requests for schedule changes, he worked with them if they served Phoebe. When they did not, he said no without apologizing for existing. That was growth for him, too. He had spent years believing calm meant yielding. Now calm sometimes meant holding the line. One Sunday, we all ended up at his house for dinner. Not Adrian. Not yet. The rest of us. Phoebe was in the kitchen criticizing the music before Julian had even finished setting the table. He had put on the same old playlist he had been defending since she was small. She informed him that 10 years of complaints should have taught him something. Julian told her 10 years of listening should have improved her taste. From the living room, Mira said he had been using that argument for 10 years too. Maeve, who had stopped by because she still remained part of our lives long after the original caregiving job ended, asked whether anyone in the family had acquired new material since 2016. I was carrying a bowl toward the table and started explaining where everyone should sit because one chair was too close to the kitchen traffic. Maeve looked at me. I stopped. Mira walked past us and sat in the chair Julian had moved from my house for the evening because, for reasons nobody could justify, the throne had become associated with family dinners strongly enough that transporting it no longer seemed absurd. Phoebe reached for the arm. Mira moved her hand away. Still not allowed. Phoebe sat on the floor beside it out of spite. Nobody corrected her. Julian burned one side of the bread. The salad dressing was missing because he had forgotten to buy it. Maeve accused him of having devoted all available memory to song lyrics from 1998. For 20 minutes, nothing important happened. After years of custody schedules and arguments about stability, the ordinary mess of that table needed no explanation. Mira's next step began taking shape that same summer. Her vocational program had gone well enough that she wanted to continue through a community college certificate connected to office and logistics work, with supported employment built into the schedule. She had become interested in route planning and inventory systems, which amused me because she had apparently inherited exactly enough of my organizational tendencies to make karma feel personal. The program would require more independent travel. She also wanted to start spending occasional nights in a supported apartment training setting connected to the program. That request hit me harder than I expected. My first reaction happened silently as I read the brochure. Distance, staffing hours, emergency numbers, transit, locks. 10 years earlier, a different residential program had nearly removed Mira from her family without her informed participation, and every word related to living somewhere else still had sharp edges. I wanted to say not yet until I was less afraid. That was how control could introduce itself even when it wore the face of protection. Mira watched me reading. She knew me too well. She asked whether I was going to make a spreadsheet. I laughed, then nearly cried, which annoyed me. I put the brochure down. Instead of listing risks, I asked what support she wanted from me. Mira wanted help comparing transportation options and understanding the program's overnight schedule. She did not want me to call the coordinator without her. She did not want me deciding which nights she would try. She did not want me packing her bag. Those requests were reasonable. They were also painful in exactly the way success is sometimes painful. For 10 years, I had packed the bag. Now Mira wanted to decide what went into it. I told her yes. The first overnight, I drove her there and stayed in the parking lot longer than necessary after she went inside. The building looked ordinary, which helped. 10 years earlier, adults had discussed another residence without giving her a real voice. This time, Mira had chosen where she was going, why she was going, and what support she wanted from me. I drove away without following her with a bag full of things she had not asked for. Adrian and Mira's relationship remained the least resolved. After the hearing, Adrian tried several times to reopen the testimony through private conversations. At first, she framed the issue as concern that Mira had been influenced. Then she moved toward hurt. She reminded Mira of school meetings, clothes, medical insurance, appointments, birthdays, all the things she had provided over the years. Those things were real. Mira did not deny them. That was what Adrian still struggled to understand. Gratitude did not require surrendering memory. Eventually, Mira agreed to meet her mother at a quiet cafe with me nearby, but not at the table. I sat far enough away that I could not hear every word. That was intentional. Mira was 18. She did not need me collecting evidence from her relationship with her mother. Afterward, she told me only the part she wanted me to know. Adrian had asked what it would take for them to have a relationship that was not about court. Mira gave her a condition. She did not ask for an apology speech. She did not demand that Adrian admit every motive Paige, Julian, or Phoebe believed she had. She asked for something simpler. Adrian had to stop telling Mira what Mira remembered, and stop telling her what her words meant before Mira had finished saying them. I asked how Adrian responded. Mira shrugged. She listened. That was not forgiveness. It was not redemption. It was a beginning small enough to be real. By fall, Adrian was spending most work weeks in Seattle and returning according to the parenting schedule. Phoebe still missed her. They still fought. Adrian still occasionally tried to persuade her that Seattle would offer more. Phoebe got better at ending those conversations when persuasion became pressure. Grant remained in the marriage, splitting some of his own time and continuing to refuse the role of automatic witness for Adrian's version of the past. Patricia still hosted lunches. She asked fewer questions that required everyone to pretend. Julian still played terrible music. Maeve still found reasons to criticize my organizational systems. The throne remained structurally sound despite 10 years of abuse. And Mira began keeping an overnight bag that I never packed. That detail probably sounds small after everything else. That detail told me more than any formal milestone. The first bag I packed for Mira had been filled while adults decided where she would live. The next one had been packed because I was terrified she might need something I had forgotten. Now she packed her own. Some weeks she forgot things. She learned. I learned not to drive after her with replacements unless she asked. Nothing about our family became perfect. Adrian still had her career, money, marriage, and legal relationship with Phoebe, along with the possibility of rebuilding something with Mira if she could learn to live inside a relationship she did not control. Julian did not become a victorious father standing over her. He became the parent Phoebe lived with most of the time, which meant laundry, missed alarms, teenage moods, school emails, and the continuing obligation to support her relationship with her mother. I did not remain Mira's permanent decision-maker either. The little girl who had once dragged a chair closer to the door while waiting for her father had become a young woman, deciding which doors she wanted to walk through herself. 10 years earlier, Adrian left court with primary custody of both daughters and believed the result proved she had won. 10 years later, Phoebe's home was with Julian because the court found that arrangement best for her, while Mira came home with me that day because she chose to. Months later, she was choosing places beyond my house too. Adrian had spent years asking which adult deserved to win the children. By the time we left that courthouse, both girls were old enough to understand the question had been wrong all along.